Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Midnight Stories. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be nice if everyone could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Alright, let's get comfy, relax, and begin. The sun was setting when I decided to take the old dirt road that cut through the backwoods behind my town. It was late spring, and the air had that cool, crisp feeling just before nightfall. I'd been meaning to explore this route for a while because I'd heard it led to an abandoned logging camp, a place long forgotten by most people. The stories about it were vague, mostly just mentions of the camp shutting down decades ago after a fire. Nothing fancy, just a curiosity I had. I figured it would be a quiet way to spend the evening, maybe take some pictures, and enjoy the silence. The dirt road wasn't easy to find at first. It was barely more than a trail, overgrown in places, with branches scraping the sides of my car. The car's tires kicked up dust and gravel as I slowly moved deeper into the woods. The trees grew thick here, tall pines and oaks that blocked much of the fading sunlight. The road curved sharply, sometimes narrowing so much I had to slow down to avoid scraping the underbrush. The smell of pine needles and damp earth was strong, fresh after a recent rain. After about 20 minutes, the trees started thinning, and I could see the outline of old buildings ahead. The logging camp wasn't as large as I had expected. Just a few wooden cabins, a small shed, and what looked like an old workshop. The buildings were all dark, some missing boards, others sagging from years of neglect. The fire must have been long ago, but I could still see the blackened wood on parts of the cabins, charred and cracked by flames. The ground was covered with dead leaves and broken branches. I parked my car on a patch of grass near the largest cabin and stepped out. The silence was almost complete. No birds, no insects buzzing, just a faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. It felt like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I grabbed my camera and started walking, taking pictures of the cabins and the surrounding forest. I moved slowly, careful not to trip on the uneven ground. As I walked around the camp, I noticed something strange. There were tire tracks on the dirt road leading into the camp, fresh tracks. It looked like a truck had driven through recently. That didn't make much sense. The road was so rough, and nobody else in town had mentioned anyone going back there for years. I kept moving toward the workshop at the back of the camp. The door hung open on rusty hinges, and inside, I could see old tools scattered on the floor, broken glass from windows, and thick layers of dust. I took pictures through the open door, then stepped inside to look around. The air inside was heavy, smelling of rust and mildew. I shined my flashlight around, trying to make out shapes in the shadows. There was a workbench covered in old tools, some still rusty, some broken. On one wall, I noticed a calendar from the 1970s, its paper yellowed and curling. I felt a strange mix of curiosity and unease. It was like time had stopped here decades ago. I stepped back outside, my foot catching on a loose board. The sudden noise startled me. I looked around, but there was nothing, no animals, no people, just the stillness of the camp. I walked toward the edge of the clearing, where the trees started again, thick and dark. That's when I saw it. A small, worn trail leading away from the camp and into the forest. The tire tracks continued down that path. It was barely wide enough for a single vehicle and looked less traveled than the dirt road. Something in me urged caution, but I was drawn to it. I grabbed my flashlight, tightened the strap on my camera bag, and started down the trail. The forest here was darker, the canopy so thick the last light of day barely touched the ground. The air was cooler, heavier with the smell of moss and decaying wood. The trail wound deeper into the trees, twisting and turning, sometimes disappearing under fallen branches and thick roots. I had to duck under low branches, brush aside spider webs, and step carefully over rocks. Every now and then I stopped to listen. The forest was alive with quiet sounds. The snap of a twig, the scurry of small animals, the distant call of a bird settling for the night. After about 15 minutes, I reached a small clearing. The ground was soft with moss, and the trees stood like silent sentinels all around. In the middle of the clearing was something I didn't expect, a rusted pickup truck half sunk into the earth, overgrown with vines and moss. The windshield was shattered and the doors hung open. It looked like it had been there for years, forgotten. I circled the truck, taking pictures and examining it closely. There were no license plates, and the inside was filled with dead leaves and dirt. But something about it fell off, like it didn't belong here in the middle of the forest. Then I heard it, a faint sound like a distant engine rumbling. I froze, turning slowly. The sound grew louder, but it wasn't from the truck. It was coming from deeper in the woods. I dropped my camera and flashlight on the ground, heart pounding. I scanned the trees, trying to find the source. The rumble turned into a low growl, steady and slow, like something large moving through the brush. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and shone it into the woods. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, shadows shifting between the trees. I started back toward the trail, my steps quickening, but the growl grew louder, closer. Suddenly, a large shape burst through the bushes ahead of me. I barely had time to react before a huge black bear appeared, snarling, eyes glowing in the flashlight beam. It was massive, its fur matted and dirty, claws digging into the earth. The bear looked angry, like it felt cornered. I froze. I remembered every story I'd heard about bear attacks. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Back away slowly. But my mind was racing, heart pounding so loud, I thought it might burst from my chest. I slowly raised my arms, tried to appear larger, speaking softly to myself to stay calm. The bear took a step forward, growling deeply, then stopped. It sniffed the air, watching me carefully. I backed up slowly, never turning my back, hands raised. The growling stopped. The bear hesitated, then turned and disappeared back into the trees. I stood there for a long moment, catching my breath, my hands shaking. The forest was silent again. I picked up my flashlight and camera, hands still trembling, and started walking back toward the camp as fast as I could without running. The path seemed longer on the way back, the darkness closing in. Every sound made me jump. The rustle of leaves, a snapping twig, the distant hoot of an owl. When I finally reached the logging camp, the sun was gone, replaced by a thick blanket of night. I got into my car quickly, locking the doors as soon as I was inside. The engine roared to life, and I backed slowly down the dirt road, eyes glued to the dark trees on either side. Driving away, the headlights illuminated nothing but thick forest. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like something was still out there, waiting. But as I drove back to the main road, the tension slowly left my body. The forest faded behind me, and the familiar lights of town appeared ahead. I realized then that I had pushed myself too far into a place that wasn't meant to be explored at night. The old logging camp was a piece of history, sure, but the forest around it was alive and wild, not something to take lightly. I made a promise to myself to never go back there alone, especially after dark. The forest held its secrets, and some of those secrets were better left alone. That night, I slept with the windows locked and the lights on. The bear was gone. The rumbling noise had stopped, and the forest was just a forest again. But the memory of those dark woods and the rusted truck would stay with me forever. It was a reminder that some places, no matter how curious we are, demand respect and caution. The night was cold and quiet when I finally pulled off the highway, my car's headlights cutting through the darkness like twin searchlights. I've been on the road all day, driving from town to town, selling tools and equipment to small businesses and workshops. My feet ached, my eyes burned from staring at the road, and the low hum of the engine had become a constant drone in my ears. I was tired, bone-deep tired, and all I wanted was a bed, a hot shower, and a chance to forget the long hours of driving. I saw the motel sign, flickering unevenly in the distance, its neon letters buzzing and struggling to stay lit. I hadn't planned to stop there, but at that moment, I didn't care. I pulled into the gravel lot, the tires crunching softly on the stones, and walked inside. The lobby was dim, with a single flickering fluorescent light overhead. The smell was a mix of stale cigarette smoke, old carpet, and something faintly sweet but almost sour, something I couldn't place. Behind the desk sat a man, probably in his late 50s, with a face weathered by years of working night shifts. His eyes were sharp but tired, and he didn't smile when I approached. He gave me the usual rundown: room rate, breakfast time, checkout rules. Then he leaned closer, his voice dropping low so I'd be the only one to hear. "There's a room at the very end of the hall," he said, nodding down the narrow corridor behind him. "Don't go near it. Don't open it. Just stay away from that one." I raised my eyebrows, surprised by the warning, but too exhausted to care much. I nodded and took the key he handed me without another word. I didn't ask why, didn't press him for details. Maybe it was a bad tenant. Maybe the room was broken or unsafe. It didn't matter. I just wanted to get to my room, lay down, and close my eyes. The hallway was long and narrow, the carpet worn thin from years of feet passing over it. The wallpaper was yellowed, peeling slightly in the corners, and the lights flickered as I passed under them. I counted the doors as I walked. 1, 2, 3, until I reached the last one at the very end. The door looked older than the others, its paint chipped and faded. There was no number on it, just a heavy, scratched metal plate near the bottom. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at it for a moment before turning away and heading to my room. My room was small and plain. A twin bed with a faded blanket, a nightstand with a lamp, a dresser with a cracked mirror. The window looked out onto the empty parking lot and the dark highway beyond. I dropped my bag on the bed and flopped down, the mattress creaking beneath me. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Finally, I could rest. I tried to shut out the sounds around me. The hum of the heater, the faint creak of the old building settling, even the distant call of a night bird. But sleep was slow to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about that door at the end of the hall, the clerk's warning echoing in my mind. Why'd he been so serious? Why'd he look so worried? About an hour after I'd settled in, I was woken by something I wasn't expecting, soft, muffled sobbing coming from down the hall. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe it was the wind or a passing car. But then the sound came again, low and trembling, like someone crying quietly in the dark. I sat up listening. The sobbing was coming from the end of the hallway, the direction of that locked door. My heart started to beat faster, a tight knot forming in my stomach. I told myself to ignore it, to stay in my room and lock the door. But curiosity clawed at me. The sound was so real, so human. Someone was in trouble. I got up slowly, my feet touching the cold floor. I grabbed the small flashlight from my bag and opened the door, stepping into the dim hallway. The sobbing stopped for a moment. I froze, waiting. Then it started again, soft and desperate. I walked slowly toward the end, the beam of light trembling in my hand. The wall seemed to close in on me, the silence stretching tight around the sound of my footsteps and the faint sobs. The further I went, the stronger the crying became. It was a man's voice, deep and ragged, broken by grief. When I reached the door, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. The desk clerk had warned me not to open it, but here it was cracked open as if someone had slipped out recently. The sobbing was coming from inside. My hand hovered over the door handle, cold sweat gathering on my palm. I wanted to run back to my room, but I couldn't. Something told me I had to see. I pushed the door open slowly, the old hinges creaking softly. The room beyond was small and dim, lit only by a flickering overhead bulb. The air smelled stale and damp, and the curtains were drawn tightly over the window. The bed was unmade, the sheets twisted and tangled. On the floor, I saw a man curled up, shaking with quiet sobs. His clothes were dirty, and he looked like he hadn't slept or eaten in days. His face was buried in his hands, but I could see his shoulders shaking with each breath. I didn't move at first, unsure what to do or say. I just watched him for a long moment, the silence hanging heavy between us. Then he looked up, eyes red and swollen, and for the first time, I noticed something else. His hand was shaking violently. There was a small cut on his wrist, bleeding just enough to stain the floor beneath him. He wasn't just crying, he was broken. I realized then that this wasn't just a sad story. This was someone who had given up. I stepped inside, my heart pounding, and sat down a few feet away, I didn't say anything. I didn't want to scare him or make him feel worse. I just sat there, the quiet between us stretching out. After a while, he stopped crying, his breathing slowing. He looked at me with empty eyes and whispered something I couldn't quite hear. I wanted to help him, but I didn't know how. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but the screen was blank, no signal. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with a man who clearly needed more than I could give. I stayed with him for the rest of the night, watching over him as he drifted in and out of consciousness. When morning came, I called the motel office and told the clerk what I'd found. His face went pale, and he told me the man had been in that room for weeks, hiding from the world after losing everything. No one came to check on him. No one even noticed the sounds coming from the end of the hall. The clerk said the warning was meant to keep people from getting involved, from disturbing the broken man who just wanted to disappear. I helped get the man some medical attention and stayed long enough to make sure he was safe. Later, I left the motel, the weight of that night heavy on my shoulders. The road ahead felt longer, darker, but I knew one thing for sure. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're the real people hiding in the shadows, fighting battles no one else can see. And sometimes, all they need is someone to stop and listen. I was driving through the Nevada desert in the early 1990s, hauling a load of freight on a lonely stretch of highway that seemed to stretch forever under the blistering sun. The road was straight, flat, and empty except for the occasional truck or car, and the desert air shimmered with heat. I had been on the road for hours, my mind drifting between the monotony of the highway and the radio playing country songs from a worn-out cassette tape. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning to dip toward the horizon, turning the sky a soft orange and casting long shadows across the sand. I noticed her as I was passing a small pullout, just before a rest stop about 15 miles down the road. She was standing on the shoulder, thumb out, but there was something off about her. She looked pale, almost too pale for someone out in the desert sun, and she wasn't waving or smiling like most hitchhikers do. She just stood there quietly, her arms folded in front of her, looking down the road in the direction I was coming from. Her clothes were simple, a faded blue jacket, plain jeans, and her dark hair was tied back loosely, strands falling over her face. I slowed down and pulled over. When I rolled the window down, she didn't say much, just quietly asked if I could drop her off at the next rest stop. I remember feeling a little uneasy, but something about her calm demeanor made me agree. I unlocked the passenger door, and she climbed in without a word. The air conditioning was blasting, but she didn't seem to notice or care. The truck felt unusually heavy, like something had changed the moment she got in. The ride to the rest stop was quiet. She didn't talk or look out the window much. I kept stealing glances at her out of the corner of my eye. Her skin was almost translucent, and her eyes seemed to stare straight through me, but not in a threatening way. More like she was somewhere else, lost in thought, or maybe just tired. I asked if she wanted some water or anything, but she just shook her head, her lips barely moving. When we reached the rest stop, she thanked me softly, almost like she was waking up from a trance. She stepped out of the truck, and I watched her walk toward the bathrooms at the far end of the lot. The rest stop was mostly empty, a few other trucks parked, and a couple of cars by the convenience store. The sun was setting quickly, and the sky was now a deep purple with stars beginning to flicker on. I sat in my truck for about 10 minutes, thinking I'd wait for her to come back, so I could make sure she was okay. I didn't want to leave her alone in a place like this, especially if she seemed so quiet and distant. But after 10 minutes, there was no sign of her. I figured maybe she'd gone into the store or something, so I got out and started walking toward the bathrooms. I passed a few truckers chatting by their rigs, but no one seemed to have seen her come inside or walk off. The convenience store clerk said he hadn't noticed anyone matching her description. I walked to the bathrooms, the cold night air suddenly feeling much sharper now that the sun had disappeared. The lights flickered overhead, and the distant hum of the highway was the only sound around. I looked inside the bathrooms, but there was no sign of her. No footprints, no bags, no belongings. Nothing. I went back to my truck and glanced into the passenger side mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw her reflection in the glass, sitting there like she had just a second ago. But when I turned my head to look inside the cab, the seat was empty. My heart started pounding. I looked again in the mirror, and the reflection was gone. I spent the rest of the night looking around the rest stop, the parking lot, and even down the highway for a few miles. There was no sign of her anywhere. I called the local sheriff's office the next morning and told them what had happened, but they said there had been no reports of missing persons matching her description. The search turned up nothing. Days later, while stopping for gas at a small station not far from that stretch of highway, I struck up a conversation with the attendant. He was an older guy who'd been working there for decades. When I mentioned the woman, his face changed. He told me something that stuck with me. A few truckers had picked up a young woman matching the same description over the years, always along that lonely highway, always asking to be dropped at that same rest stop. No one ever saw her get out, and no one knew what happened to her after. He said some thought it was a trick of the desert, or maybe a person who was lost or in trouble, but nobody had any real answers. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but there were no ghosts, no monsters, just a pale, quiet woman who vanished without a trace. I kept driving that route for years afterward, always scanning the road for her or anyone like her. Sometimes, on long stretches of the highway, I'd see a flicker of movement or a shape standing by the road. But whenever I stopped or slowed down, there was nothing there. It was real, but it was impossible to explain. The desert has a way of swallowing people whole, or maybe she just never wanted to be found. Whatever it was, it stayed with me, quiet, pale, and gone before I could understand what I was even looking at. The weekend started off exactly how I had hoped, quiet, peaceful, and far away from everything. I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods, tucked away from the noise of the city, to escape the constant rush of my daily life. The plan was simple: spend a couple of days alone, read, relax, maybe go for some hikes if I felt like it. I wanted to disconnect, recharge. I never expected to feel this uneasy or to want to leave so quickly. The cabin itself was old but well kept, built mostly of dark wood that had weathered over time. It stood on a slight clearing surrounded by tall pines that creaked in the wind. I pulled up in my car late Friday afternoon. The road was narrow and bumpy, but I made it without incident. When I stepped inside, the smell of pine mixed with faint dust hit me immediately. The cabin was simple but cozy. There was a small kitchen, a living room with a wood stove, and a bedroom off to the side. The big mirror on one wall of the living room caught my eye right away. It was nearly floor to ceiling, framed in dark oak, and stood opposite the window, reflecting the forest outside. It made the space feel bigger, but something about it also made me pause, as if it was watching. At first, I dismissed the feeling. I put down my bags and started unpacking. The air inside was cooler than outside, probably because the windows were all closed to keep out bugs and the chilly evening air. I brewed some coffee, sat down on the couch, and looked around. Everything was peaceful. The sounds outside were normal: birds, the wind, and the trees. Nothing unusual. That night, I fell asleep easily. The quiet was a welcome change from the constant hum of the city. But the next morning, I noticed something strange. I was brushing my hair in front of the big mirror when I saw my reflection lag behind me for a moment. It was subtle, but the mirror didn't quite match my movements perfectly. At first, I thought I was imagining it, or maybe my eyes were just tired. I waved my hand, expecting to see the reflection wave back. Instead, the reflection just stared at me. Not a normal staring, but a blank, still look. No movement. I froze, blinking several times. Then I waved again. Nothing. The reflection didn't move at all. I stepped back, heart pounding a little. This didn't make sense. The room was empty except for me. The light was good, and the mirror was clear. I tested again, moving my arm slowly, then quickly. The reflection was there, but not copying me properly. It was as if it was disconnected. I told myself it was a trick of the light, or maybe the glass was old and warped. The mirror was big, after all, and had probably been there for decades. But the feeling lingered, a cold knot of fear twisting in my stomach. I decided to stay away from it and focus on other things. Throughout the day, I noticed small things that unsettled me more. The mirror would catch my eye when I wasn't looking directly at it. Sometimes I'd glance, and see the reflection not quite lining up with reality. Once I saw my reflection sitting on the couch while I was standing near the window. It made no sense. I even took my phone out to record it, hoping to catch the lag, but when I played it back, everything looked normal. No lag, no frozen images, just me moving in sync with my reflection. I slept with the curtains drawn that night, trying to block out any strange shadows from the woods. But the mirror still sat there, silent and unblinking. The next morning was colder, and there was a thick mist hanging over the trees. I woke early and walked into the living room to make coffee. The cabin was quiet except for the soft hiss of the stove heating up. When I looked over at the mirror, my breath caught in my throat. The glass was fog, but from the inside, it looked like someone had been breathing on it from behind. I blinked, stepping closer. The fog was uneven, like a hand had brushed across part of it. I put my fingers on the glass to wipe it, but there was nothing behind it. The mirror was flush against the wall. There was no way anyone could be behind it. It was mounted solid, no gap or space. I tried to shake it off as a weird condensation effect. Maybe the humidity from outside and the warmth inside was causing it. But something didn't feel right. The fog pattern almost looked like a face, or at least part of one, an eye or a mouth pressed up against the glass. It faded after a few minutes, but the chill stayed. I packed up my things that morning. The plan to stay the whole weekend vanished with the fog mirror. I didn't want to ignore the feeling, the subtle warning that something wasn't right. Before leaving, I stopped at the small general store on the way back out of the area. I asked the owner about the cabin, trying to sound casual. She hesitated, then told me the cabin had belonged to a man who disappeared several years ago. No one knew exactly what happened to him. Some said he left suddenly, others that he vanished without a trace. The place had been empty for a long time before it was rented out again. Driving away, I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something watching me from the woods. But all I saw was the empty road stretching behind me. I haven't gone back. I don't know what I saw in that mirror or why it didn't move like me. Maybe it was just an old glass with strange reflections, or my mind playing tricks when I was alone. But I know one thing for sure. There was something about that cabin, something I couldn't explain, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out what it was. I remember the day like it was yesterday, though I still struggle to explain everything that happened. It was a regular Saturday, and I was feeling restless, so I decided to take a drive out to a place I'd heard about but never been, an old abandoned quarry a couple of hours out of town. Nothing fancy, just a spot where people sometimes go hiking or fishing, but it had been closed off for years due to safety concerns. I was curious and figured, why not? I wanted to get away from the noise and just be alone with my thoughts. I packed some water, snacks, and my phone and headed out mid-morning. The drive was long but pleasant. The road wound through thick forests, with sunlight streaming through the trees in long beams that moved as the car passed. I rolled down the windows to feel the fresh air, the kind that smells like pine and wet earth after rain. The birds were loud in the early morning, and I could hear the rustle of small animals scurrying in the underbrush. When I finally got to the old quarry, the first thing that hit me was the silence. It wasn't just quiet like the peaceful silence you get in the woods. It was heavy, almost like the sound was sucked out of the air. No birds, no wind, no movement at all except for the faint trickle of water somewhere deep in the pit. The place was surrounded by steep cliffs of jagged rock, and I could see remnants of old mining equipment rusting away near the edges. The sun was still climbing, but the quarry's deep pit was mostly in shadow, making the water at the bottom look black and still. I started walking around the rim, stepping carefully on the loose gravel. There were spots where the ground looked like it might give way, so I kept my distance. It was easy to see how this place had been shut down. The risk was obvious. As I walked, I found an old wooden ladder lying against a ledge. It looked rickety, but seemed like the only way down. I hesitated, thinking about how dangerous it was, but the quiet was starting to feel oppressive, and I wanted to explore more. So I tested the ladder carefully, putting my weight on the first few rungs. It creaked, but held. Step by step, I climbed down. The further I went, the colder it felt. The air was damp, and smelled faintly of mold and whetstone. When I reached the bottom, the water was closer than I expected, a shallow pool covering part of the pit floor. I couldn't see how deep it went. The walls were rough, covered in moss and streaks of mineral deposits. The water reflected the tiny patch of sky above like a black mirror. I took a small rock and tossed it in. The splash echoed off the cliffs, sharp and hollow. I started walking around the bottom, stepping on wet rocks and mud. It felt like stepping into another world. Time seemed to slow down. I felt isolated but strangely calm. Then I noticed something strange, faint footprints in the mud, leading away from the water and towards a narrow tunnel carved into one side of the quarry wall. I knew I shouldn't go in. The tunnel looked old, probably part of the mining operation, and could be unsafe. But my curiosity pushed me forward. I took out my phone and switched on the flashlight, then slowly entered the dark passage. Inside, the air was colder and damper. The sound of dripping water echoed around me. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough to walk through, and the walls felt slimy to the touch. I moved cautiously, my footsteps loud in the quiet. After about 50 yards, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. The light from my phone barely reached the far side. The chamber was huge, like a cavern carved by hand. Old wooden beams crossed the ceiling, some broken and rotting. The smell was stronger here, something earthy, but also like rust and something metallic. I saw old tools scattered around, half buried in dirt and dust. Then, as I moved further in, I spotted something that made my heart skip. There was a small pile of belongings in the corner, a worn-out backpack, some empty cans, a torn blanket. Someone had been here recently. I stepped closer, my mind racing. Who could it be? Why would someone stay here in a place like this? I thought about calling out, but didn't want to disturb whoever was here or alert them I was around. I took a deep breath and started to back out slowly. That's when I heard it, a faint noise like the scrape of a rock against stone, coming from deeper in the chamber. My pulse quickened. I froze, shining the flashlight towards the sound. The beam caught movement, a shadow slipping behind a pile of rocks. I called out softly, telling whoever it was I meant no harm. There was no answer. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe someone homeless hiding out. But then the sound came again, louder this time, and it wasn't an animal. It was deliberate, like someone dragging something heavy. Without thinking, I turned to leave quickly, my steps echoing on the hard floor. The passage felt narrower, the walls closing in. I could hear footsteps behind me now, slow but steady. I started to run, slipping on wet mud, trying to find the ladder back up. My breath came fast, my heart pounding so loud, I thought it would burst through my chest. The tunnel seemed endless, like it twisted and turned, but I kept going, driven by panic. Then I tripped on something and fell hard. The flashlight spun from my hand, rolling away into the dark. I scrambled to my knees, reaching out, but couldn't find it. I was left in darkness, the silence broken only by heavy breathing behind me. I sat frozen, ears straining. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath. After a moment, I heard a low voice, not speaking, just a guttural sound, almost a growl. Fear rooted me to the spot. I tried to control my shaking hands and breathing. Then, out of the darkness, a rough hand grabbed my arm, pulling me up. I struggled, but the grip was strong. I forced myself to stay calm, thinking maybe I could reason with whoever it was. I looked into the eyes of a man, gaunt and dirty, with wild hair and a face that looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were tired but sharp. He didn't say a word, just pulled me toward the back of the chamber, then stopped at a small hole in the wall. I could see daylight through it, the tunnel's other exit. Without any warning, he shoved me through the hole, and I scrambled out into the bright sun. I didn't look back. I ran, not stopping until I was back at the car. I didn't go back to the quarry again. When I told myself the story afterward, it didn't seem real. But I keep thinking about that man. How lost and scared he must have been to live down there, hiding from the world. I learned that some places aren't just abandoned. They're forgotten for a reason. And sometimes, what's lurking isn't something supernatural. It's just people caught in dark places they never should have been. That day changed how I see the world. It's easy to ignore what we don't understand. But that's how people get left behind, lost in silence. I hope whoever that man was found a way out someday, and I'm grateful I got out when I did. I was hiking alone on a quiet trail deep in the woods. The day had started out clear and bright, with the sun shining through the tall trees and lighting up the forest floor. I had planned this trip for weeks, wanting to get away from everything and spend a day in nature by myself. The trail was narrow and winding, the dirt soft under my boots, lined with ferns and patches of moss. Birds chirped somewhere high above, and every now and then a small animal rustled through the leaves. It felt peaceful, like the whole world had slowed down just for me. I kept a steady pace, my backpack snug against my back, the weight of water, snacks, and some extra clothes reminding me that I was prepared. The air smelled fresh, with hints of pine and damp earth. Every step I took seemed to echo softly, mixed with the sounds of the forest. I stopped once to take a drink from my water bottle, sitting on a fallen log and looking around. The trees were tall and thick here, their branches tangled and full of green leaves. Sunlight filtered through, casting moving patches of light and shadow on the ground. After a while, I got back up and continued. The trail started to climb a little, winding between rocks and roots that stuck up like broken bones from the earth. My legs worked hard, and I felt my breathing deepen. As I went higher, the trees grew thinner, and the sound of the birds faded away. The forest felt quieter now, heavier, like it was holding its breath. The air grew cooler, and I noticed a faint mist starting to curl around the trunks. I stopped again, wiping sweat from my forehead, and looked around carefully. There was nothing unusual, just the empty trail stretching ahead and the soft rustling of the wind in the branches. But then, just as I was about to start walking again, I heard it, a voice calling my name. It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but clear. My name, spoken slowly, with a strange, low tone that made my skin prick. I froze, my heart pounding hard in my chest. "Hello," I said quietly, looking toward the shadowed trees off the trail. Nothing moved. No sound answered except the gentle rustling of leaves. The voice came again, closer this time. It was just behind a thick stand of pines, their dark trunks standing like silent guards. The voice didn't shout or scream. It was almost calm, almost like someone was just trying to get my attention. But I knew I was alone. I hadn't seen or heard another person all day, and the trail was remote, miles from the nearest road or camp. I spun around, looking down the path I had come from, then toward the way I was supposed to go. Nothing. No sign of anyone. My skin was cold now, and I felt a tight knot of fear coil inside me. I told myself it was probably a trick of the wind, or maybe some animal mimicking a sound. But my gut told me otherwise. I started walking faster, my boots crunching on the dry leaves and twigs. I didn't want to look back, didn't want to listen for the voice again. But it came. A third time, louder, closer. My name, clear and sharp, right beside me now. It was coming from the shadows between the trees. I stopped again, frozen in place. The mist seemed to thicken, swirling around my feet. The air felt thick and heavy, like something was pressing down on me. I strained my eyes, trying to see into the dark underbrush. Branches and leaves moved slightly, but I still couldn't make out a figure. No footsteps, no sound except my own ragged breathing. Then I heard something else, a faint crack of a twig breaking. It was close, very close. Something was moving in the woods near me. My heart raced so fast, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I grabbed my phone from my backpack, my hands shaking, and tried to turn on the flashlight. The screen flickered before it finally lit up, the beam cutting through the mist. I pointed the light toward the sound. The trees stood like silent watchers in the circle of light. I saw a few small animals scurry away, a squirrel, a rabbit, but no people. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just another hiker who had called my name as a joke, or someone else on the trail. I decided to keep moving, but I chose a different path, stepping off the main trail onto a smaller side path I had spotted earlier on the map. It looked like it would loop back to the main trail a little further up. I walked faster now, glancing over my shoulder every few steps, the beam of my flashlight sweeping through the trees. The forest seemed to close in around me. The mist wrapped around the trunks and stones like a living thing, thickening with every step. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch underfoot and the low whistle of the wind through the trees. And then the voice again, right behind me this time, so close it was like a breath on my neck. My name, slow and low, almost a growl. I didn't stop. I ran. My feet pounded on the soft earth, and my breathing was ragged and loud in my ears. The path was steep and uneven, roots and rocks making it hard to keep my footing. I tripped once, catching myself just before I fell. The voice followed me, echoing in the trees, close enough that I could swear it was just steps behind. I scrambled up a small hill and saw the main trail below me, just a few yards away. Relief flooded through me. If I could get back to the main trail, maybe I could find my way out or meet someone. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, my arms swinging. When I reached the main trail, I didn't stop. I kept moving, eyes scanning the woods on both sides. The voice didn't come again. I was sure I was alone. After what felt like an hour, I finally saw my car parked where I had left it, its dark shape barely visible in the fading light. I broke into a run, and the relief was overwhelming. I reached the car, unlocked the door with trembling hands, and jumped inside. I locked the doors and sat there for a few minutes, my heart still racing. The woods were silent now. No voices, no sounds but the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. I tried to think clearly to make sense of what had happened. Had I really heard my name being called? Or was it just my mind playing tricks after a long day of hiking alone? I checked my phone for signal and called a friend. I told them I was on my way home and would meet up soon. I didn't want to be alone anymore. I started the engine and drove off, not looking back. Later, I thought about what had happened. I realized that it wasn't ghosts or anything supernatural. It was something much simpler. Someone had been out there, calling me, maybe lost or trying to scare me. But I never saw anyone. I never heard footsteps except my own. And whatever it was, it stayed hidden in the shadows. I learned to trust my instincts that day. When something feels wrong, even if you can't see it, you have to listen. And sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's in front of you, but what you can't see just beyond the edge of the light. I moved into the farmhouse in late September. It was an old place built in the 1930s with creaky wooden floors, drafty windows, and a roof that popped and cracked at night when the air cooled. But it was cheap, and I needed cheap. My divorce had just finalized. I had no kids, and the quiet suited me. No neighbors within a mile. Just the wind, the trees, and my own breathing. The house sat on 6 acres of mostly overgrown land. A long gravel driveway curved around a dried-up well before ending in a rickety wooden carport. The basement was old stone, the kind that smelled like damp earth no matter the season. The upstairs had 3 bedrooms, though I only used one. The others stayed empty, doors closed, windows covered. I liked it better that way, less space to worry about. The first night, I heard the phone ring at 2:04 a.m. I thought it might be a wrong number. It was a landline. I didn't even want a landline, but it came with the house and my cell barely got reception out there. I was already awake when it rang. Insomnia had been creeping in more and more lately. I didn't answer. The sound of it, sharp and sudden in the dead quiet, had been enough to make me sit upright in bed. I let it ring 6 times before it stopped. I didn't think much about it, but the next night it rang again, 2:01 a.m. this time. Still, I didn't answer, just lay there listening. I stared at the ceiling and counted the rings. 7, then silence. Not even crickets, just that kind of stillness that makes your own breath feel too loud. On the 3rd night, the call came again, 2:03 a.m. I picked up the receiver this time. I was irritated, and I said nothing. Just lifted the phone and waited for whoever it was to speak. There was no voice, just breathing. A low, slow, steady breath. Not rapid or panicked, calm, like someone resting. I waited for words, but they never came. After maybe 30 seconds, I hung up. It was the first time I really felt the air in my lungs start to hitch a little. After that, it was every night, always between 2 o'clock and 2:05. Always the same. No talking, just that quiet, eerie breathing. It didn't sound like a prank. It didn't sound like a recording either. I don't know how to explain it, but the sound felt present, like it was near. I stopped answering. I just let it ring and tried to cover my ears with a pillow. But I always ended up awake anyway, just waiting for it to start. After the 6th night, I called the phone company. They said they could set up a trace, but only if I answered and stayed on the line for a full minute. I agreed. That night, I waited for the call. I watched the clock tick past 2 o'clock, then 2:01. At 2:03, the phone rang. I answered it and held it close. Again, the breathing. Calm, steady. My heart was pounding in my ears, but I kept quiet. I stared at the wall across the room and forced myself to count out 60 seconds in my head. I didn't say a word. I just listened. At 1 minute, I hung up. The next day, I got a call from the phone company. They said the trace had worked and they were passing the information on to the police. They didn't say where the call had come from, just that the authorities would follow up. I didn't sleep much that night. The next evening, just as the sun was going down, I heard a knock on my door. 2 sheriff's deputies stood on my porch. One of them looked serious. The other looked like he was trying not to look concerned. They asked if they could come in. I let them. We sat in the kitchen. I hadn't cleaned up yet, so there were crumbs on the table and a coffee ring on the counter. The deputy with the lighter hair asked if I had been alone in the house. I told him yes. I didn't even have a dog. He nodded, then said something that made my stomach flip inside out. The calls were coming from inside the house. Not a metaphor. Not a prank from someone in the woods. They had traced the number to my own landline. Someone had been using my phone to call me. The only phone was in the hallway outside the bedroom. I hadn't noticed anything strange about it. It wasn't off the hook. Nothing was broken or tampered with. I asked them if it could have been a glitch. They shook their heads. They asked to search the house. We started in the basement. I didn't go down there much, only to reset the breaker once when a fuse popped. It was cold and always smelled like wet leaves. The stone walls were stained with age. The deputy with a flashlight scanned slowly, pausing now and then to tap on walls or look behind shelves. Then he stopped at the far end, near the old boiler. There was a section of the wall that looked off. It was paneling, not stone, cheap plywood covering something. He knocked on it, and it echoed hollow. He called me over and asked if I knew what was behind it. I told him no. He pried the edge with a crowbar he got from his car, and the panel cracked and came loose. Behind it was a narrow crawl space, maybe 4 feet high and 6 feet deep. Not big enough to stand, just a narrow space like a burrow. Inside was a filthy sleeping bag, food wrappers, mostly granola bars, a few fast food bags I didn't recognize, probably brought in from town, a couple of water bottles, an old flashlight, and a half-empty pack of cigarettes. It smelled terrible, like sweat, mold, and something sour I couldn't place. Worse than the smell was the realization. Someone had been living in my house. They'd crawled out after I went to bed, picked up the hallway phone, and dialed my number just to breathe in my ear. Every single night. They must have crept back into that little hole before morning. Somehow I never saw them, never heard them. Not a footstep, not a whisper. The police did a full sweep. They found a small folding knife and a torn-up jacket stuffed in the corner of the crawl space. They didn't find the man himself. He must have left that day, maybe realized the trace was happening. They figured he'd been slipping out at night through the back storm door that led down into the basement from outside. The lock was busted. I hadn't noticed. He must have been slipping back in the same way. They said it wasn't the first time something like this had happened. People living in attics, basements, sheds, usually vagrants or people with mental illness. Sometimes they just want shelter. Sometimes they want more. I changed the locks. I had the basement door replaced and bolted from the inside. I had motion lights installed around the house. I started sleeping with a hammer on my nightstand and a flashlight close by. For weeks, I checked the basement twice a day, every day. I even tore out the rest of the paneling to make sure there were no more hidden spaces. He never came back, but I kept thinking about how long he might have been there. The food wrappers didn't look old. Some had dates from a week or 2 before. But how long before that? Had he been there the first night I moved in? Had he watched me carry in boxes, pick a bedroom, make coffee? Had he watched me sleep? I started finding things I thought I had misplaced, shirts I swore I hadn't left in the laundry, A cup I found in the living room when I knew I'd left it in the kitchen. Nothing big, nothing obvious, but little things that didn't sit right. Eventually, I sold the house. I told the new buyer everything. They still wanted it. Said it was nothing some cameras and good locks couldn't fix. Maybe they were right. I moved to a small apartment in town. I can hear my neighbors through the walls sometimes. I used to hate that. Now it feels like comfort. I still don't sleep through the night. I still wake up around 2 a.m. sometimes, heart racing, ears straining for the sound of a ringing phone. I unplug my landline, but I swear, in the quiet, I still think I hear the click of the receiver being lifted. The faintest breath on the line, but it's nothing. I'm alone now. I lock every door. I check every room. I keep a bat beside the bed. And still, sometimes I wonder if I ever really knew how alone I was. The forest was thick and quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you and makes every small sound feel louder than it should. I had been hiking for hours, lost in my own thoughts, enjoying the way the tall trees filtered the late afternoon sunlight into soft green patterns on the forest floor. The air smelled fresh and earthy, a mix of damp leaves, pine, and moss. The deeper I went, the more I noticed the broken branches and piles of cut wood stacked in messy heaps alongside the trail. It was clear that the forest wasn't untouched. Someone had been working here, cutting trees and clearing the brush, but still felt wild and remote. As I moved deeper into the woods, the trail started to disappear, swallowed up by thick bushes and fallen branches. I decided to leave it and follow a narrow path made by animals or maybe people who didn't use the main route. The forest was quieter here, almost unnaturally so. The usual sounds of birds chirping or squirrels running up trees were missing, replaced by a kind of low hum from the wind passing through the branches. I didn't mind. It was peaceful, but also a little unsettling. After about 20 minutes, I stumbled upon something odd, a pile of branches and logs that had clearly been chopped and stacked recently. It was a slash pile, a messy heap left over from logging or clearing the forest floor. The wood was fresh and smelled strongly of sap. At the edge of the pile, something caught my eye. A small, worn shoe lay on top of the branches. It was a child's shoe, a little sneaker, faded and dirty, with one of the laces undone and trailing off the pile like it had been tossed there without care. I knelt down to look closer. The shoe was old, maybe weeks or months, but it was definitely a kid's. It was too small to be anything but a child's shoe, the kind you'd see on a 5 or 6-year-old. The sole was scuffed and the fabric was torn in a few places. The sight of it felt strange, almost out of place in such a wild, empty spot. I looked around, expecting to see a child nearby, but the forest was still and empty. Then I heard it, faint laughter. It wasn't a loud or clear sound, more like a soft, distant giggle carried on the wind. It was the kind of laughter a child might make while playing hide and seek, light and careless. I froze. The sound came again, a little louder this time, but still far off and impossible to locate. I scanned the trees and the brush, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone else. Just the quiet forest and the smell of pine. The laughter stopped. A heavy silence took its place, thicker than before. My skin prickled, and I felt a sudden chill despite the warm air. I stood up and looked back at the slash pile. The shoe still lay there, unchanged. I couldn't explain why, but my stomach twisted into a knot. The place felt wrong. I moved closer to the pile, careful not to disturb anything. I tried to think through what I was feeling. Had a child been here recently? Lost? Hurt? Did someone come after them? The thought was hard to shake. The forest was deep and isolated, and if a child had wandered here alone, it could be dangerous. The absence of any footprints or other signs was puzzling, but maybe the soft earth had covered them by now, or maybe the child had been carried away. I picked up the shoe carefully, turning it over in my hands. It was light, empty. I looked around again, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The laughter hadn't come back. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I decided to keep moving, wanting to get out of the thick trees and back to the trail I'd lost earlier. But as I turned, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. A small figure, maybe a child, darted between the trees at the edge of my vision. I spun around fast, but there was nothing there. Just the dense brush and shadows. My heart pounded. I told myself it was just a deer or some small animal, nothing more. But something about the way the figure had moved, too quick, too purposeful, didn't feel right. I stepped forward cautiously, following where I thought the figure had disappeared. The forest got darker as the sun sank lower. Shadows stretched long and thick, twisting between trunks. The silence returned, broken only by the crunch of my boots on dry leaves and twigs. The air felt heavy, almost humid, and I could smell something else now. Something faint and sharp like burnt wood mixed with something sour. I came to a small clearing, a patch of soft moss surrounded by thick trees. The slash piles were more frequent here, like someone had cleared this spot carefully. At the edge of the clearing, I saw a faint trail of tiny footprints leading away into the trees. They were small, like a child's, but the dirt was soft and easily disturbed. The prints were fresh, no older than a day. I followed them, stepping carefully over roots and low branches. The footprints led deeper into the woods, winding between thick trunks and bushes until they stopped abruptly at the edge of a steep drop. A narrow ravine cut through the forest, its walls covered in moss and ferns. The bottom was hidden by shadows, and I could hear the faint sound of water, a small stream or creek running far below. I looked down the ravine. It was deep and dangerous. If a child had fallen here, it would be bad. I called out softly, but the only answer was the echo of my own voice and the distant rustle of leaves. A cold feeling settled in my chest. I scanned the edges of the ravine, hoping to see something, a toy, a piece of clothing, anything. But there was nothing. The footprints stopped too suddenly, like whoever made them had vanished into thin air. The sun was almost gone now, and the forest was growing dark fast. I knew I needed to get back to the main trail before night fell completely, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong here. As I turned to leave, the faint laughter came again, softer this time, almost a whisper. It seemed to come from all directions, circling me. I stopped and listened, heart racing. The laughter faded slowly, replaced by the deep, steady sound of the creek and the rustling leaves. I kept walking, my steps quicker now, pushing through the bushes toward the trail I had left hours ago. The forest closed in around me, the dark thickening with every step. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the trail, the last light of day was gone. The path was easier to follow now under the weak beam of my flashlight. I walked steadily, the strange feeling easing as the sounds of the forest returned. Birds calling in the distance, the occasional snap of a twig from a small animal. Later, at home, I tried to make sense of what I had seen. The child's shoe, the laughter, the footprints that vanished by the ravine. It was a puzzle I couldn't solve. There were no reports of missing children in the area, and the forest was rarely visited this late in the year. I wondered if the shoe had been there for months, left behind by some kid who had wandered close to the logging area. Maybe the laughter was an echo, a trick of the wind or the way the forest carries sound. But something about the whole thing stayed with me. The way the laughter seemed so real, but no child ever appeared. The way the footprints led to nowhere. The cold feeling in the pit of my stomach that wouldn't leave. In the end, I realized the forest was just a place where strange things could happen. And sometimes people leave behind pieces of their story without ever finishing it. That shoe was a sign, maybe a warning, that even in the quietest places, life goes on in ways we don't always understand. I never found out what really happened, but I know one thing for sure. Some mysteries don't need ghosts or fairy tales to be scary. They're scary just because they're real, and because sometimes the forest keeps its secrets well hidden. I rented the cabin for a few days to get away from everything. Work, people, noise. It was one of those small, old cabins tucked deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, the kind you find by accident if you take the wrong turn on a dirt road and keep driving until the pavement ends. I had the address from a website where people rented out private cabins. usually for hunting or fishing trips. The photos showed a modest, weathered building with a porch and wood stove inside. Nothing fancy, but it promised quiet and solitude. I arrived late afternoon and found the place exactly as described. A single story, rough pine boards on the outside, windows clouded with dust and grime from the last storm. A thin layer of moss covered parts of the roof. The porch creaked under my feet as I stepped out of the truck and locked the door behind me. The owner had left a key in a box nailed to a tree, just like the instructions said. No one was around. The silence was heavy, not the peaceful kind, but that kind that feels like the forest is watching you, waiting. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and damp earth. The windows barely let any light through, and I could see dust floating in the air. The furniture was sparse and worn. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a small bed with a thin mattress, and the wood stove sitting cold in the corner. I stacked some firewood near it, hoping to make a fire later when the temperature dropped. I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking my things, then went for a short walk around the property. The cabin was surrounded by thick trees, mostly pines and firs, so close that I could barely see more than 50 feet in any direction. The ground was littered with pine needles, small rocks, and fallen branches. It was quiet except for the occasional rustle of a squirrel or bird. I kept checking my phone for signal, but got nothing. No surprise, I expected it. That first night, I went to bed early, hoping to catch up on rest. The cabin was cold, so I built a small fire in the stove and sat close, reading an old paperback I had brought along. As darkness fell, the forest outside turned into a shadowy wall, and I started hearing the usual night sounds. Distant owls, the rustling of leaves, maybe a deer moving through the brush. Nothing unusual. Around midnight, I was just about to turn off the light and sleep when I heard it, footsteps on the porch. At first, I thought maybe the owner was coming by to check on the place or bring something. I called out, "Hello," but got no answer. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then moved slowly along the edge of the porch, pacing back and forth. It was the sound of heavy boots or shoes pressing on the wooden floorboards, deliberate and slow, not like an animal or a small person running. I stayed still, listening closely. The door was locked tight, and I could see the bolt in place from where I sat by the stove. Whoever was out there couldn't get in without breaking something or having a key. The footsteps circled the cabin, moving from one side to the other, always just out of reach of the windows. Every step echoed in the silence, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried calling out again, but no answer came. The footsteps stopped suddenly, just outside one of the windows facing the woods. I held my breath, eyes fixed on glass. The window was old and slightly foggy, but I thought I caught a shadow, a figure standing very still. Then it moved, a slow step back, and the footsteps resumed, retreating around the cabin's edge and disappearing into the darkness. I stayed up the rest of the night, pacing between the porch and the small living space, checking the locks, the windows, everything. I didn't sleep much, and when dawn finally crept through the trees, I was exhausted and jumpy. The next morning, I stepped outside to look for clues about who had been on the porch. The ground was damp with dew and soft from the previous night's rain, making footprints easy to spot. Near the porch, I saw a set of fresh prints, heavy boots, maybe size 11 or 12. They circled the cabin, matching the pattern I had heard the night before. The strange part was what happened next. The trail led into the woods, but ended abruptly about 20 feet from the tree line. The ground beyond was undisturbed, with no signs of anyone passing through. It was like whoever had been walking around the cabin just vanished. There were no broken branches, no crushed leaves, no flattened grass. Nothing. I followed the prints a few more steps, eyes scanning the thick forest. There was no way anyone could have disappeared into thin air. The woods were dense, but not impassable. The trail should have continued. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. My mind raced with possibilities, but none made sense. Was it an animal? No, the prints were definitely human. Someone hiding? But where and why? The cabin was isolated, with no neighbors for miles. If it was someone watching, why not make contact? I checked the cabin carefully, doors, windows, even the chimney for signs of forced entry. Nothing. No fingerprints, no marks, no disturbance inside. I called the owner's number again, but it went straight to voicemail. I packed up some gear and decided to leave a little early. I wanted to get out of that place before something worse happened. Before I left, I looked around the porch one last time. The wood was worn but solid. The hinges were tight. No sign of tampering. The footprints outside were the only clue I had, and the mystery of their sudden disappearance gnawed at me all the way back to the highway. In the weeks after, I told a few friends about what happened. Some said it was probably a hunter or a lost hiker checking the cabin. Maybe, but the locked door, the quiet pacing, and the vanished prints never sat right with me. I never stayed in a cabin that remote again. Not because I'm scared of ghosts or monsters, but because sometimes real things happen in places where no one else is watching, and some things just don't have easy answers. I parked my old truck on the gravel road that led up to the cabin. The sun was just starting to sink behind the hills, casting long shadows through the dense forest. The trees stood tall and close together, like a wall of green and brown stretching as far as I could see. The air was cool but not cold, carrying the faint smell of pine and wet earth. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks, a quiet break from the city noise and the endless emails. Just me, the cabin, and the forest. The cabin was small and simple, made of weathered wood that looked like it had been there for decades. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by thick woods. The windows were dirty and streaked, but I could see the basic furniture inside. A worn sofa, a small wooden table, and a stove that looked like it might still work. I threw my pack on the ground and unlocked the heavy door, which creaked as it swung open. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of dust and old wood. I pulled the curtains back to let in the last of the light and set about unpacking. I had brought enough food and water for a few days, some books, and my old camping gear. No phone service here, no internet, no distractions, just silence and the forest. As night fell, I built a fire in the stone fireplace. The flames crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney. The room filled with a warm orange glow, and I settled into the sofa with a book. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves and branches. The occasional hoot of an owl or the distant bark of a coyote broke the quiet. I was halfway through a chapter when I heard it, a soft noise outside, like something scraping against the side of the cabin. My heart skipped. I set the book down and listened. The noise stopped, then started again a few minutes later. It was faint, almost like nails or claws scratching on wood. I got up and peered out the window, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. The fire was low now, and shadows danced across the walls. I shook my head and tried to tell myself it was probably just a tree branch or an animal passing by, maybe a raccoon or a deer. I went to bed early that night, but sleep didn't come easy. Every small sound made me jump. A twig snapping, the wind whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. I kept thinking about that scratching noise, and I wasn't sure if it had really been there or if I had imagined it. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate steps moving around the cabin. I froze, listening as the footsteps circled the building once, then stopped. For a moment, everything was silent again. Then the footsteps started moving away, fading into the distance. I lay there, heart pounding, waiting for more sounds. But there was only the steady rhythm of my breathing and the soft whistle of the wind. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I woke early and went outside. The forest was bright and still, the sun filtering through the branches. I walked around the cabin, looking for signs of what had been there the night before. On the ground near the back door, I found deep scratches gouged into the wood frame. They were fresh, the wood splintered and raw. I didn't know what had made them, but I felt a cold knot in my stomach. Someone or something had been here, close enough to touch the cabin, close enough to see me. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, then went back inside. All day, I tried to focus on simple tasks. I cleaned the cabin, stacked firewood, and explored the nearby trails. The forest was beautiful, full of tall trees and moss-covered rocks. Birds sang in the branches above, and a small creek ran nearby. It was peaceful, but there was always that edge of unease, like I was being watched. That evening, I decided to make dinner outside, using the small grill near the fire pit. The sun was setting, turning the sky a deep red. As I cooked, I kept glancing toward the tree line, expecting to see movement. But there was nothing. After dinner, I sat by the fire again, reading and listening to the night sounds. The scratching noise didn't come back, but something else did. The footsteps. Slow, heavy steps just beyond the clearing. They moved in a circle like the night before, stopping and starting. I didn't want to look, but I had to know. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the edge of the clearing, shining the beam into the trees. The light caught on something, a figure standing still just beyond the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, just a shape. I called out, but there was no answer. The figure melted back into the trees. I ran back to the cabin, slammed the door, and locked it tight. My hands were shaking. I checked the windows again, then sat down by the fire, trying to calm myself. The forest was alive with noises, but none of them felt normal anymore. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the fire until it burned low, then lay on the sofa, fully dressed, a knife on the table beside me. Every sound made me tense. The wind, the animals, the footsteps that I thought I heard circling the cabin again. At dawn, I made a plan. I would leave. Not tomorrow, not when the sun was up, but now. I packed my things quietly, trying not to wake any animals or alert whoever or whatever had been outside. I unlocked the door and stepped out into the early morning light. The forest was still and quiet, but the air felt heavy. As I started walking down the gravel road toward my truck, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The scratches on the wood were sharp and jagged, like claws. I shivered. I reached the truck and climbed in. The engine roared to life, and I drove away fast, not stopping until I was back on the main highway, surrounded by other cars and people. I didn't look back again. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who or what was out there in the woods, but I learned something important that weekend. Sometimes the quiet and the stillness aren't peaceful. Sometimes they're a warning. And when you hear footsteps outside your door in the middle of the night, it's best to listen, because whatever is there won't always stay quiet. The night had settled in deep, heavier than any night I'd experienced in a long time. The woods around our campsite were dark and silent, except for the soft crackle of the fire we had built earlier. Our group was made up of 5 friends, me included, and we had set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. The kind of trees that block out any moonlight or distant city glow. So the night was pitch black beyond the firelight. We'd been talking and laughing earlier, passing around a bottle of water, sharing stories, just enjoying the quiet that only comes when you're away from phones and the usual noise of everyday life. The fire was dying down slowly, the logs giving off a soft, warm glow. My eyelids were starting to feel heavy, and I was glad when a few of the others decided to turn in early. We all had our sleeping bags stretched out around the fire pit, close enough to keep the fire going for a while, but spread out just enough for some personal space. I was just about to close my eyes when I heard it, a soft crunch of footsteps coming from somewhere just beyond the edge of the clearing. I froze. The sound was faint, but it was definitely there. Footsteps on dry leaves and twigs, slow and deliberate. Not the usual rustling of small animals or the wind moving through the branches. I nudged one of my friends who was lying near me. His eyes flicked open and we both sat up listening. The footsteps stopped, and a few seconds later, we saw it. 2 beams of light, flashlights, moving slowly and carefully between the trees on the far side of the clearing. We all sat up fully now, alert. The others had woken up too, rubbing their eyes and trying to make sense of the moving lights. Nobody said a word. The footsteps started again, and the flashlights moved closer to the edge of our camp, just beyond where the firelight reached. At first, I thought it was one of our friends going for a late-night bathroom break or checking something outside the tents. But then I remembered. Everyone had said they were staying put, too tired to move. We all agreed earlier we'd stick together. Something about the way the lights moved felt wrong, like whoever was out there wasn't just wandering, but searching for something. Or maybe someone. I quietly grabbed my own flashlight from the ground and motioned for the others to follow. We slipped out of our sleeping bags and moved toward the trees, careful not to make noise. The fire flickered behind us, a small bright circle in the dark, and the cold night air bit my skin. The forest smelled like wet leaves and pine needles. The flashlights moved again, this time circling the edge of our camp, swinging slowly between the trees. It was like whoever was carrying them was trying to stay just out of sight, but close enough to see what was inside the clearing. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, a tight knot in my stomach. My mind raced. Was this someone from outside the group? A hiker? A hunter? Someone with bad intentions? We stayed low, moving quietly through the underbrush, trying to keep the flashlights in sight without being seen. As we got closer, I caught a glimpse of the person carrying the light. They were wearing dark clothes, the kind that would blend in well with the night. Their face was hidden by a hood or a hat, so I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. The group whispered among themselves, questions hanging in the air, but no answers. We decided to move closer to try to get a better look, but as we advanced, the flashlights suddenly stopped. The footsteps ceased again. It was completely silent. We held our breath. The forest seemed to hold its own breath with us, waiting. Then, without warning, the flashlights swung sharply back into the woods and disappeared. The footsteps, too, moved off quickly, crunching through leaves and twigs, heading away from the camp. We followed the sounds as quietly as we could, weaving through trees and dodging branches. The footprints they left in the dirt were fresh, too deep to be an animal. After a few minutes, the sounds and lights faded into the distance. The forest swallowed them whole, and all that was left was the quiet hum of night insects and the distant call of an owl. We stood there for a long moment, looking at each other in the dark, trying to figure out what just happened. Everyone was shaken, but nobody wanted to speak first. Then I realized something. When we had first seen the flashlights, none of us had checked if anyone was missing from camp. So we turned back, walking fast, anxious to get back to our tents and make sure everyone was okay. As we stepped into the clearing, our flashlights bounced off the tents, the sleeping bags, the backpacks, all still there. Inside the tents, faint shadows moved as people stirred awake. We called out quietly, and each friend answered back, sleepy and confused. No one had left camp. No one had moved or walked outside in the night. We gathered in the fire pit's circle again, voices hushed but tense. No one had gone out. The only people around were us and whoever had been walking outside in the woods, shining flashlights near our camp. It didn't make sense. If none of us had left, who had been there? We checked the perimeter again, flashlight beams scanning the edges of the clearing, but we found nothing. No footprints going away, no signs that anyone had been there besides us. The dirt around the camp was undisturbed except for our own tracks. A cold feeling crept over me. Not from the night air, but from the thought of someone so close, so near to us, but completely unseen. The idea that someone had been circling us quietly, watching us, made my skin crawl. We sat back down by the fire, still alert. We decided to keep the fire burning bright the rest of the night and to stay awake in shifts, each watching the edge of the forest. No one wanted to say it, but the possibility of someone with bad intentions had crept into our minds and refused to leave. The rest of the night passed slowly, with every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves setting us on edge. The stars wheeled above us in a clear sky, the forest silent except for our nervous whispers and the crackling fire. When dawn finally came, pale and cool, we packed up fast and left that clearing without looking back. The sun brought warmth and safety that night had stolen away. We never found out who had been there, circling our camp, shining those flashlights in the dark. But the memory of that night, the feeling of being watched and surrounded by something unseen but very real, stayed with me long after we returned to the safety of our homes. The woods can hold secrets, not all explained, but some are just too close for comfort. And sometimes the scariest thing isn't a ghost or a monster. It's knowing that someone was out there, near you, when you thought you were alone. I inherited the cabin from my late grandfather. It was a small, weather-beaten place deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. My grandfather had kept it for decades, rarely visiting in his final years, but it was his home, and now it was mine. The moment I drove up the long, winding dirt road that ended at the cabin, I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. The air smelled of damp pine and earth. The trees around the cabin were tall and thick, their branches tangled like giant fingers reaching over the roof. The wood of the cabin was aged and gray, with patches of moss clinging to the corners. The windows were dusty and dark, hiding whatever might be inside. The first few days I spent cleaning and organizing, trying to make the place my own. The cabin had been left almost untouched since my grandfather passed, and the dust and cobwebs told stories of years spent alone. I found his old furniture, a few cracked mugs in the kitchen, and stacks of yellowed newspapers in the corner. The electricity had been shut off, so I worked mostly during daylight, using candles at night. The quiet was heavy, almost suffocating. One afternoon, I decided to explore the basement. I had never been down there before. My grandfather had always kept it locked. The wooden stairs creaked under my feet as I descended into the dim space. The basement was cold and smelled musty, filled with old tools, boxes, and broken furniture. As I moved around, my flashlight beam caught on a small door set into the far wall, almost hidden behind some crates. It was a narrow door with a rusty lock I had never noticed. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled my pocket knife from my jacket and started working on the lock, my hands trembling a little. After a few minutes, the lock gave way with a soft click. The door swung open to reveal a tiny room, no bigger than a closet. Inside was a small wooden table with a single, battered leather-bound diary resting on it. The pages were brittle and yellowed, but the writing was still clear. The handwriting was shaky and uneven, like the writer had been writing in fear or haste. The entries were dated, going back many years, and I realized this was my grandfather's diary. As I flipped through the pages, a chill ran down my spine. The diary was full of terrifying stories, strange noises outside the cabin at night, the feeling of being watched, footsteps crunching through the leaves even when no one was supposed to be around. He wrote about a presence in the woods, something he called the Watcher. The entries grew darker as the weeks passed. He described hearing heavy breathing just beyond the windows, finding strange scratches on the doorframe, and once seeing tall shadows move between the trees. His handwriting became messier, his words more frantic. One of the last entries stopped me cold. Tonight it came closer than ever before. I don't know what it is, but it watches, waits, never leaves. It knows I'm alone. I'm locking the door now, hiding this diary here. If you find it, don't open it. Don't let it inside. The final page was smudged, as if he had tried to write more, but was interrupted. There were no more entries. I sat in the dark basement, holding the diary tightly, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to leave the cabin immediately, but something made me stay. I put the diary in my backpack and locked the small door again, hoping to forget what I had read. That night, I was restless. I lay awake on the creaky bed, the cabin eerily silent except for the faint whistle of wind through the trees. Suddenly, a deep rattling sound shook the windows. It was rhythmic, like something large was moving just outside, trying to force its way in. My breath caught in my throat as the noise grew louder. Then I heard heavy footsteps thumping softly on the wooden porch, circling the cabin slowly, deliberately. I pulled the blankets over my head, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But the footsteps didn't sound like any animal I knew. They were too heavy, too slow, like a person carrying something big and heavy. I forced myself to peek out the window, holding my breath. There was nothing there. The trees were still, shadows stretching long in the moonlight. The porch was empty, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I stayed up the rest of the night, eyes glued to every window, listening to the silence that fell back over the cabin. The next morning, I found fresh scratches on the doorframe, just like my grandfather had described. The wood was torn and splintered, as if something sharp had tried to claw its way inside. I locked every door and window, making sure everything was secure, but the fear settled in deep. Over the next few days, the strange noises continued. Footsteps circling the cabin, branches snapping just beyond the edge of the clearing, and sometimes a low, guttural sound that I couldn't place. The phone had no signal here, and the nearest neighbor was miles away, so I was completely alone. I started keeping the diary close, reading it over and over for clues. My grandfather had written about signs to watch for, times when the watcher was most active, and ways he tried to keep it away. But nothing seemed to work. The watcher stayed just outside, invisible but always present. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest darkened, I decided to face it. I went outside, flashlight in hand, and walked slowly around the cabin, calling out into the silence. The trees were still, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. I found broken twigs and deep footprints in the dirt, footprints too large to be human. I didn't see anything, but I knew I wasn't alone. The watcher was out there, somewhere, watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. From then on, I kept the cabin secure and avoided going outside at night. I spent most of my time reading the diary, trying to understand what I was dealing with. The last entry haunted me. Don't let it inside. I didn't know what it was, but I wasn't going to find out the hard way. Days passed, and the footsteps continued, always circling, never breaking in. I made sure all the windows were locked tight, nailed boards over the weakest ones, and kept a heavy knife by my bed. The nights were long and sleepless, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of branches snapping or the windows rattling. Then one morning, I found a gap in the boards over the back window, wide enough for something to squeeze through. I checked the rest of the cabin, but nothing else was disturbed. I felt a surge of panic, but tried to stay calm. If the watcher was trying to get in, I had to be ready. I spent the next days reinforcing every entrance and making sure I was never alone in the cabin. I kept a fire burning in the fireplace to keep warm and stayed close to the center of the house. The footsteps came every night without fail, but they never tried to break in again. Slowly, I started to piece together what my grandfather had feared. The watcher wasn't a ghost or some supernatural being. It was something real, an animal or a person living in the woods, watching the cabin, waiting for the right moment. Maybe it was a wild animal, or maybe something darker, someone who had been in those woods too long, losing their mind or worse. I realized my grandfather had been trying to protect himself from something dangerous, but couldn't explain it clearly. The warning in the diary was simple: keep it outside. Don't let it inside, no matter what. After 2 weeks, I finally felt brave enough to leave. I packed my things, locked the cabin one last time, and drove away down the long dirt road. I didn't look back. I never returned to that cabin. The memory of those nights, the heavy footsteps, the rattling windows, the feeling of being watched, stayed with me for years. I kept the diary safe, but never opened it again. Some things are better left alone. That cabin, and whatever watched from the woods, remained a dark secret of the past. Real, terrifying, and waiting quietly just beyond the trees. I've been thinking about that weekend for years now, and it still feels strange every time I replay it in my mind. It started off as a simple plan, just me and my partner wanting to get away from the city, from the noise and the stress. We found this cabin deep in the woods, far off the beaten path, where we could spend a quiet weekend. The pictures looked cozy: a small wooden cabin surrounded by tall trees, a creek nearby, and no neighbors for miles. It sounded perfect. When we arrived late Friday afternoon, the air was already cool and smelled of pine and wet earth. The road leading to the cabin was narrow and dusty, lined with thick trees that blocked out most of the fading sunlight. By the time we pulled up, the sky was turning a dull orange, and the forest around us looked quiet, almost too quiet. The cabin itself was made of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a small porch. It looked exactly like the photos, maybe even better in person. The owner, a woman in her late 50s or early 60s, met us at the door. She was friendly but reserved, with pale skin and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything. She handed us the keys and gave us a few brief instructions: how to start the wood stove, where the firewood was stacked, how to use the old well water for drinking. Then she mentioned the guest book. She said it was a tradition that every guest who stayed in the cabin signed it, and we should do the same. It was inside on a small wooden table near the entrance, bound in a thick leather cover, with yellowed pages inside. We thanked her and told her we'd settle in. She left with a small wave, and the door closed behind her with a soft click. The inside of the cabin smelled like with smoke and something else, maybe dust and old fabric. The ceiling beams were dark and rough, and the furniture was simple but sturdy. A small kitchen with a cast iron stove, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch with worn cushions, and a single bedroom off to the side. The windows were small, but looked out onto the trees all around. After unpacking, we sat down at the table and opened the guest book. It was heavy, the pages thick and soft from years of use. The entries went back decades, some from the early 1950s, others more recent, into the 1980s and 90s, with neat handwriting, scribbled notes, and a few drawings. It was like a little history of everyone who had stayed here, their names, dates, and sometimes a few words about their stay. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed something strange. Near the end of the book, the entries suddenly slowed down. There was a block of pages filled with names that stopped abruptly. The last signature was dated about 10 years ago. That was odd because the owner had said she rented the cabin regularly, and here we were, supposedly the current guests. But there was no entry after that last one from a decade ago. I showed the guest book to my partner. We both found it weird, but didn't think too much of it at the time. Maybe the owner just forgot to give out the book, or maybe some guests didn't bother signing it. Still, it fell off. That first night, after we lit the wood stove and ate dinner, we settled in. The cabin was quiet, but as the night deepened, strange things started to happen. I heard noises, soft knocks on the wooden walls, the creaking of old beams, and at times a cold draft that swept through the room despite all the windows and doors being shut tight. It was the kind of cold that made your skin prickle like something unseen had passed through. My partner noticed it too. We checked the windows and doors several times. Everything was locked. I tried to ignore the noises and the cold drafts, but they kept happening. Every now and then, there was the faint sound of footsteps outside, crunching leaves or twigs breaking, but when we looked out the windows, there was no one. The woods were still, dark, and empty. We both felt uneasy but chalked it up to the cabin being old and in the middle of nowhere. Old buildings make noises, especially at night, and the wind through the trees can sound like footsteps. We tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun was just rising, painting the forest in soft pinks and oranges. The cabin felt different in daylight, warm and less threatening. I went back to the guest book to look more closely at those last few pages. The entries from 10 years ago were just names and dates. No messages, nothing to explain why it stopped. Curious, I decided to take some photos of the pages to show the owner later. Maybe she'd have some answers. When my partner woke up, I showed them the pictures. They looked puzzled too. We spent the day exploring the woods around the cabin, hiking a short trail that led to the creek. The forest was dense, the air fresh, and the silence peaceful except for birdsong and the occasional rustling of small animals. The quiet was almost a relief after the strange noises of the night before. That evening, after another cold draft and some more noises, we finally decided to ask the owner about the guest book. She had agreed to meet us at the cabin around dinner time to drop off some extra firewood and check on things. When she arrived, her face was pale. I showed her the guest book and the section where the name stopped 10 years ago. I asked if she knew why no one had signed it since then, even though she rented the cabin regularly. She looked down for a moment, then back up with a serious expression. She said the cabin had been empty for years, not rented or used, but she kept the book as a tradition. She said she hadn't expected anyone to come back or want to stay. It was like a family heirloom now, a memory of the past. That didn't make sense. We were there. We had the keys. We had stayed in the cabin. But if the owner hadn't rented it, how did we get the keys? How did the place get cleaned and ready? We pressed no further. The owner seemed uneasy, and we didn't want to upset her. That night, we looked again at the guest book. The pages were blank after the last entries from 10 years ago, but the book felt heavier, as if the weight of those years filled the room. Then we noticed something that made the blood drain from our faces. The names we had signed on the first day were missing. Our signatures were gone, erased as if we had never been there. We searched the entire book, page by page, multiple times. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but the ink from decades ago was still visible. Our handwriting was nowhere to be found. We tried to convince ourselves it was a trick of memory, but we both remembered clearly signing the guest book when we arrived. The name, the date, our short message. But the book told a different story. We packed up quickly the next morning. The air felt colder, heavier. The woods seemed darker, the silence louder. On the drive back, we talked about what had happened. We realized the cabin had not been rented for years. The owner was renting it out in name only, maybe for money or out of habit. The guest book was a relic, never used by guests in recent years. But then how had we gotten in? How had we stayed there? And how had our signatures disappeared? It dawned on us that the cabin itself had become isolated, cut off from time somehow, a place where guests never truly arrived or stayed. The owner was renting it, but no one actually used it anymore. We understood then the strange noises and cold drafts. Not supernatural, but the natural decay of an empty building, the wind through cracks, the old wood settling and creaking. The isolation played tricks on us, made the silence oppressive and the shadows deeper. We never went back. The cabin, the guest book, the missing names, it all fit together in a quiet, unsettling truth. The cabin was abandoned in everything but name. We were the last visitors, though our presence was erased, just like the years that had passed since anyone truly stayed there. It was a weekend getaway that never really happened. It started on a cool autumn afternoon when a group of 5 friends and I rented a cabin deep in the woods. The place was supposed to be perfect for a weekend getaway. Quiet, isolated, and far from the noise of the city. The cabin looked sturdy enough from the outside, built with old dark wood that had weathered years of wind and rain. The porch was covered in dry leaves, and the smell of pine filled the air. We were excited to escape and just relax, cook some food, and enjoy the peaceful forest. When we first walked inside, the cabin felt cozy but a little old. The wooden floor creaked under our boots, and the faint smell of dust and old would hit us as we entered. The windows were thick, and the sunlight made the dust in the air shine like tiny stars. There were 2 rooms, a living area with a fireplace and a small kitchen. Then there was a narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. Everything looked worn, but clean enough for a weekend stay. Near the kitchen, there was a door that caught my attention. It was different from the others, sturdier, made of heavy wood with no windows or glass panels, and locked tight with an old metal lock. It looked like it hadn't been opened in a long time. I asked the owner about it when we met him outside before we went inside. He said it was just for storage and there was nothing inside, so he didn't bother giving us the key. He seemed to brush it off like it was nothing important. We all laughed about it at first, making jokes about what could possibly be behind the door. But the curiosity lingered. None of us knew what was in there, and the owner's dismissive answer didn't help. We wanted to see inside, but with no key, there was no way. Still, the door's presence made the cabin feel different somehow, like there was a part of the place locked away, hidden from us. That evening, after unpacking and having dinner, we all gathered around the fireplace, the flames casting warm shadows on the walls. The air outside had turned colder, and the trees outside whispered with the wind. As night fell, I couldn't stop thinking about that door. Something about it felt off. Curiosity got the better of me, so I tried to look through the crack under the door. The lock made it almost impossible to open, but there was a tiny gap at the bottom. I knelt down, careful not to make noise, and peeked through. At first, all I could see was darkness and dust. Then, faintly, I thought I heard something slow, shallow breathing. It was so quiet I wasn't sure if my mind was playing tricks on me. I looked again, listening hard. There was that soft, uneven breath coming from inside the locked room. I stepped back quietly, heart pounding. I told the others what I heard, but no one believed me. They joked it was the wind or maybe some old heating pipes creaking in walls. But I knew what I heard. It was breathing, real breathing, coming from behind that door. Later that night, when everyone else was asleep, I lay in my bed wide awake. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the wood and the distant sounds of night animals. Then, I heard it, a faint scratching noise coming from behind the locked door. Slow and deliberate, like someone or something was scraping their nails or claws against the wood. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. The sound made my skin crawl. I got up and pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath. The scratching stopped for a moment, then started again. I backed away slowly, feeling the panic rise. The room felt colder suddenly, like a shadow had passed over the air. I didn't tell anyone, afraid they'd think I was imagining things. The next morning, when the sun finally came through the windows, we all got up and started packing. Something about the night had changed the mood. We were quieter, less relaxed. I went to check the locked door again, and my heart jumped. It was slightly open, just a little, maybe an inch or two. I pushed it slowly, expecting to see some empty storage room, or maybe old tools and boxes. But the room was empty, nothing but dust and old cobwebs. There was no sign of anyone or anything. No footprints, no objects, no evidence of movement. Just an empty, dark space. The air inside smelled stale, like it hadn't been opened in years. I called the others to look, but they just shrugged and said maybe the wind had pushed the door open. But the cabin's interior was tight and closed, and the door was heavy. It seemed impossible for wind alone to open it. We left soon after, feeling a strange unease. The whole weekend that was supposed to be fun and relaxing felt like a nightmare we barely understood. I try not to think about the breathing or the scratching, but it stuck with me. Weeks later, out of curiosity, I searched for any information about the cabin. I found a review from the previous renters who had stayed there a few months before us. They wrote about hearing noises behind that door, but said they never stayed the whole night because the sounds scared them away. They never explained what was inside, and no one else had answers. The owner never spoke about the door again, and no one could tell me why it was locked or what was kept in that room. The mystery stayed with me, more real than any ghost story. It wasn't about ghosts or spirits. It was something else, something human, or maybe something left behind. The cabin was old, surrounded by dense forest, far from help or other people. I started thinking maybe someone had used that room to hide something, maybe a trapped animal, or worse, a person. The breathing I heard could have been a person hiding or locked in there once, and the scratching was a desperate attempt to get out. Whatever it wasn't a friendly secret. The fact the owner didn't want us to see inside made me wonder if they knew what was behind that door all along. When we found the room empty the next day, maybe whoever or whatever was there had been taken away, or maybe it was just hiding too well. The whole experience left me with an uneasy feeling about that cabin. Some places hold memories and secrets not meant for visitors. And sometimes those secrets don't want to be found. I never went back, and I don't think I will. That locked door remains a mystery, a silent warning to anyone who might stay there again. It's a reminder that not every locked door is empty behind it, and sometimes it's better not to know what's waiting on the other side. The cabin was supposed to be a perfect escape. My wife, Rachel, and I had been planning this little trip for months. We were both exhausted from work, city noise, and everything that comes with living in a crowded place. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far away from anything. No shops, no neighbors, no distractions. Just us, the forest, and silence. When we arrived, the sky was already getting dark, but the sun still peeked through the tall pine trees. The gravel road ended at a small clearing where the cabin stood. It was old but well-maintained, with wooden beams and a stone chimney. The porch creaked slightly under our feet as we stepped inside. The smell of pine and old would fill the air. The place had a certain charm, nothing fancy, but cozy enough for two people to relax. One thing we noticed right away was the lack of cell phone reception. Rachel tried her phone near the window, but but there was nothing. No bars, no signal, just a blank screen. I checked mine, and it was the same. We shrugged it off. We wanted a break from the constant buzzing of notifications anyway. The first night was peaceful. We lit the fireplace, made some dinner, and talked about how nice it was to get away. No emails, no calls, no texts. Just us and the quiet. Around 10 p.m., Rachel's phone suddenly rang. It was odd because we both knew there shouldn't be any reception. She looked at the screen, an unknown number, one neither of us recognized. She hesitated, but answered it anyway, curiosity getting the better of her. All she heard was heavy breathing, not loud, but steady, close, and unsettling. No words, no background noise, just that slow, heavy breath over and over. I watched her face tighten, eyes narrowing. She said nothing, just hung up. The moment she did, she tried calling the number back, but the line was disconnected immediately. The phone showed number not in service. She frowned and turned the phone off for the rest of the night. I didn't think much of it first. Maybe some weird glitch or a prank call, but with no reception, it made no sense. How did the call even get through? The next morning, we talked about it over coffee. Rachel was unsettled, but tried to brush it off. I suggested it could be a pocket dial or some signal interference from a distant tower. We agreed not to worry and planned to spend the day hiking. Over the next couple of days, strange things started happening. The phone calls came back, always late at night or very early in the morning, when the cabin was dark and silent except for the forest sounds outside. Rachel's phone would ring, showing the same unknown number. When she answered, there was only the heavy breathing again. No other noise, no words. At first, she would hang up immediately. Then she started leaving the phone on speaker, trying to hear if there was anything else, but nothing changed. The breathing was steady, like someone was just holding the phone up to their mouth and breathing heavily, maybe trying to scare us. She tried blocking the number, but still came through. Sometimes the phone would ring twice in a row, sometimes just once. The calls were always at odd hours, sometimes just after midnight, other times around 4 a.m. or even 6 a.m., right when we were trying to fall asleep or just waking up. We both grew tired and tense. It was impossible to sleep well. Every time the phone rang, our hearts jumped. We never knew when it would come, but we feared it every time. Rachel's mood changed. She became quiet, sometimes jumpy, staring at her phone like it might suddenly scream or whisper something at her. I started checking the cabin more closely, looking for anything out of place. The windows were all locked, no signs of anyone around. The door to the cabin had a solid deadbolt. There was no way anyone could have been near us without us hearing them. We even checked the phone's call logs. The number was always the same. It never changed. Yet every time we called it back, it was disconnected or didn't exist. On the third night, things got worse. The call came just after 2 a.m. Rachel's phone rang sharply, breaking the silence. I was already half awake, and the sudden sound made me sit up. She answered. The breathing was there again. But this time it wasn't just breathing, it was heavier, harsher, like someone was struggling to breathe. It felt different, more urgent, but still no words. She hung up and looked at me with wide eyes, shaking her head. I told her to turn the phone off and put it in my backpack. We sat in silence by the fireplace, listening to the crackling flames. Outside, the wind blew through the trees, and an owl hooted somewhere in the distance. It was peaceful, but inside the cabin, the tension grew. By the next morning, we agreed that we couldn't stay any longer. The calls had ruined the peace we came for. There was no explanation, no way to stop it, and no one to call for help since there was no reception. As we packed, I found something strange on the porch, a small, crumpled piece of paper tucked under the welcome mat. I unfolded it carefully. It had a series of numbers written on it, like a phone number, but scratched out and nearly unreadable. Beneath it, a short message, "Stop looking." I showed it to Rachel, and her face turned pale. We knew then that whoever was behind the calls was close. The message wasn't a prank, it was a warning. We loaded our bags into the car quickly and started the engine. The gravel crunched under the tires as we drove away, the cabin disappearing behind us into the woods. On the way back to town, I tried calling the number again, just to be sure. It was still disconnected. We never found out who made those calls or why. No one else seemed to have had the same experience in that area. The cabin owners never mentioned anything when I called later to explain why we left early. To this day, Rachel's phone still shows the unknown number in the blocked list. Neither of us will ever forget those nights filled with heavy breathing on the line, calls that came from nowhere, and a warning that made it clear we were not welcome. We never went back, and I hope we never will. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're just the unknown, the people who want to remind you that you're being watched, and the silence that follows heavy breathing on the other end of a phone you thought was dead. We all needed a break. After months of work, stress, and city noise, my friends and I decided to rent a cabin out in the woods for the weekend. It was a small group, just 5 of us, and we figured it'd be a good way to unwind. No Wi-Fi, no distractions, just the forest and each other. The place was tucked deep in the woods, a couple hours drive from the nearest town. The kind of place that feels like it's been forgotten, hidden away from the world. The cabin itself looked older than we expected. Weathered wood siding, a sagging porch, windows with dusty panes. There was an old wood stove inside, a dining table scratched from years of use, and a stack of firewood that looked like it hadn't been touched in a while. It wasn't fancy, but it had charm, and more important, it was isolated. The first day went well enough. We unpacked, set up our things, and went for a hike nearby. The forest was thick, with tall pines that blocked most of the sunlight. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the breeze, and there was a quiet stillness that felt strange but also peaceful. After dinner, we sat around a fire pit outside, drinking and telling stories under the stars. No one mentioned the eerie feeling that settled over me when I looked up at the dark tree line, but I felt it all the same, like something was watching from just beyond sight. That first night, we all crashed early. The cabin creaked as the wind blew through the trees. At first, it was comforting, the sounds of an old house settling. But as the night grew late, the noises started to feel different, more deliberate somehow. The floorboards groaned in places where no one was walking. A window rattled softly in its frame. I convinced myself it was nothing and fell asleep. The second night is when things got strange. I woke up in the middle of the night because I felt cold, even though the fire had burned low in the stove. I rubbed my arms, trying to warm up, and when I opened my eyes, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the room near the window. It wasn't clear, more like a shadow, a dark shape that didn't move or blink. It just stood there, silent, staring in my direction. My heart slammed against my ribs. I blinked hard, thinking it was a trick of the light or maybe my tired mind playing games. But when I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. The room was empty. I lay still for a long time, eyes wide, waiting for some sound or movement. But there was nothing except the faint creak of the cabin settling again. I didn't want to wake anyone else, so I kept quiet and eventually fell back to sleep, though my mind stayed restless. The next morning, I didn't say anything about it. I figured maybe it was just a shadow or my imagination fueled by the old cabin's atmosphere. But I noticed the others looked tired too, acting a little off. As the day passed, small things started happening. At first, it was subtle, like a misplaced book on the shelf or a chair slightly pushed away from the table. We joked about it being a prank or one of us sleepwalking, but then the odd stuff grew harder to explain. One morning, we found strange scratches on the living room wall. Thin, deep lines that looked fresh, almost clawed into the wood. None of us had done it. We all agreed because we'd been careful around the cabin, not wanting to damage anything. The air inside the cabin felt heavier, colder. No matter how many logs we threw on the stove or how many windows we opened to air it out, that chill stuck around. It wasn't like the cold from outside. It was more like the temperature dropped in patches, moving through the rooms unpredictably. At night, I found myself waking up again, listening to noises I couldn't explain. Footsteps, faint and distant, coming from the porch or the hallway. Doors that seemed to close softly on their own. Sometimes the creaking floorboards felt too close, like someone walking right next to my bed. None of us saw the shadow figure again, but the feeling never left. We started sleeping in shifts, one of us always awake to keep an eye on the cabin. On the third night, the tension was thick. No one spoke much, and when we did, our voices were low and shaky. We kept the fire stove burning late, and I stayed awake, watching the shadows dance on the walls. I went over every possible explanation in my head. Animals, branches brushing windows, the house settling, exhaustion messing with our minds. But none of it really fit all the pieces. Then, during the day, we found something in the attic. We hadn't planned to go up there. It was dark, dusty, and cramped, but someone noticed an old trunk in the corner covered in cobwebs. We pried it open, and inside was a stack of old papers and photographs, yellowed and brittle with age. One photo caught my eye right away. It was a faded black and white picture of a man standing proudly in front of the cabin. His clothes were from decades ago, maybe the 50s or 60s. He looked serious, almost grim. But behind him, in the shadows of the photo, was a dark shape, tall and vague. The shape had the same outline as the shadow figure I'd seen the night before. We passed the photo around quietly, each of us unsettled. The man was the cabin's previous owner, a fact confirmed by some old letters and documents in the trunk. The story was strange. He had disappeared without explanation years ago, leaving the cabin abandoned until it was rented again. It hit me hard. Whatever we were feeling, seeing, or experiencing wasn't some ghost story or folklore. There was something real here, something tied to the history of the cabin and that missing man. The scratches, the cold spots, the shadow. Maybe it was a person or someone who used the cabin before us. Maybe the man didn't just disappear. Maybe something happened to him, something that left a mark on the place. We packed up that night. None of us wanted to stay a moment longer. The air inside the cabin was oppressive, heavy with secrets and unspoken threats. We didn't talk much on the drive back, each lost in our thoughts about what had happened. In the weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled on something dangerous. Not supernatural, but very real. The kind of danger that hides in silence, in shadowy corners of abandoned places, waiting for the next person to come too close. I never went back to that cabin, and if I ever hear about it again, I'll remember the photo, the dark figure standing silently behind a man who vanished without a trace, and the cold weight of something watching, just out of sight. The cabin stood at the edge of a dense forest, far from any town or road, hidden behind tall pines that blocked the wind and swallowed most of the daylight. It was old but sturdy, with wooden walls darkened by time and a roof that creaked when the wind blew. The gravel driveway leading to it was rough, making the car bounce and rattle with every bump. We'd rented it for a week, hoping for a quiet break away from the city, a place to relax and enjoy nature. The kids were excited, 2 little girls and a boy, and my wife and I had our own hopes for peace and rest. When we first arrived, the owner was waiting outside. He was an older man with a rough face and tired eyes, dressed like someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. He handed us the keys and gave us a quick walkthrough of the cabin. It was simple inside, a living room with an old stone fireplace, a small kitchen with a wood stove, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom. But there was one thing that stood out immediately, a heavy wooden door set into the floor in the corner of the living room. It looked out of place, darker and more solid than the rest of the cabin, with a strong metal lock bolted on. He warned us once, very clearly but quietly, not to go down there. He said it was locked for a reason. That basement hasn't been used for years, he said, looking at me like he didn't want to get into it, but also didn't want us to be careless. Some accident happened down there a long time ago. It's best to just leave it alone. That was all he said, and I didn't press him. It felt like one of those old cabin stories people tell, a place with some secret best left unopened. I told the kids it was just an old storage space and locked it up in my mind. The first day passed quietly. We hiked along the nearby trails, cooked dinner over the stove, and made a small fire outside. The girls ran around the yard chasing bugs and collecting pine cones, and our son kept asking to explore more. Night came early in the forest, and after tucking the kids into bed, my wife and I sat by the fireplace, the light flickering against the walls. The basement door was there, a dark square in the floor, locked and silent. The second night was when things started to feel off. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when the youngest girl, Emma, came in holding her blanket tightly. She looked scared, her eyes wide. "Daddy," she said quietly. "I hear a man crying downstairs." I paused, rinsing a plate, and tried to smile. "There's no one down there, Em. It's just the wind or maybe the pipes." She shook her head, her lip trembling. "No, really, it's a man. He sounds sad, crying." I glanced toward the basement door, where the lock glinted dimly in the kitchen light. I wanted to believe her. The rest of the house was quiet, the woods outside silent except for the soft rustle of leaves. I told her to try to ignore it and that we'd check in the morning. Later, my wife was reading in the living room when she heard it too. At first, she thought it was a trick of the night sounds. An owl, maybe, or a distant animal. But the sound was too steady, too clear. A low, soft crying, muffled but unmistakable. She called me over, and we stood quietly by the basement door, listening. It was definitely there, faint, distant, like someone trapped far below. I knocked on the door, firmly, expecting no answer. None came. The crying stopped immediately, as if whoever it was had heard me and gone silent. My heart pounded. I called the owner on the phone, hoping he'd explain what was going on. He answered but was tight-lipped. He refused to talk about the basement in detail, just repeating that it was sealed after an accident years ago. No one was supposed to go down there. He said that the crying we heard must be the wind or the old cabin settling. But his voice didn't sound convincing. That night, the crying came again. It woke me up. I lay in bed listening, frozen, as the quiet sobs echoed through the floorboards. The sound wasn't just a trick of imagination anymore. It was real, and it was coming from beneath us. It wasn't the wind. It was something alive down there, trapped or hurt and unable to get out. We couldn't stay. The next morning, we packed quickly. The kids were quiet, their earlier excitement gone, replaced by a strange heaviness. As we left, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The basement door stayed shut, but I could almost feel something watching us, waiting below the locked floor. Driving away, the woods closed behind us like a wall, hiding whatever was trapped down in that dark basement. I never called the owner again. I never wanted to know more. All I knew was that sometimes the past stays locked up for a reason, and some doors should never be opened. The first thing I noticed about the Airbnb was how quiet everything was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy, unnatural kind that seemed to press in on me from every side. It was late afternoon when I arrived, and the small town where the house was located felt almost empty, like a place that time forgot. I'd booked the place on a whim, needing to get away from the noise and chaos of the city for a few days. The listing promised a cozy cabin retreat and showed pictures of a neat, two-story wooden house surrounded by trees. It looked perfect online, simple, clean, and remote. What I didn't realize was just how isolated remote really meant. The driveway was a rough gravel path that curved between dense stands of pine and fir trees. I had to drive slow because the gravel was loose and the tires kicked up dust that hung in the still air. When I finally pulled up to the house, I got out and looked around. The sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows that made everything look darker than it really was. The house itself was old but well maintained. The wood siding stained a deep brown with a porch that wrapped around the front. There was a single porch light that flickered faintly, struggling to stay on. Inside, the house smelled like wood and something faintly musty. It had that old house feeling where the air feels a little thick and stale, like it hadn't been opened up properly in a while. The floors creaked under my feet, and the windows were slightly fogged, but the place was clean. I unpacked slowly, trying to settle in, but even as I moved around, I felt the weight of the silence. There were no sound from neighbors, no distant traffic or birds chirping, nothing but the quiet hum of the house itself. I tried to distract myself by exploring the house. The kitchen was small, but had everything I needed: a stove, a tiny fridge, some basic dishes, and silverware neatly stacked in cabinets. The living room had a couch and a few chairs, and a TV mounted on the wall, though the remote didn't seem to work. Upstairs, there were 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The windows in the bedrooms looked out onto the thick forest, but the glass was old and slightly warped, making everything outside look blurry. That night, after eating a simple dinner of soup and bread, I sat on the porch, hoping to soak up some fresh air. The sky was clear, and the stars were sharp and bright. The silence outside was total, like the forest itself was holding its breath. After a while, I went back inside, locked the doors, and tried to watch some TV, but it was just static. I ended up reading a book by flashlight in the living room, but I kept hearing small noises, creaks, thuds, the faintest scratching sound from upstairs. The scratching sound kept me awake longer than I wanted. It wasn't consistent. Sometimes it would stop for long minutes, then start again, light and soft like nails dragging across wood or maybe a branch scraping the side of the house. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the house settling or the wind outside, even though there was no wind at all. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke early and made coffee in the tiny kitchen. The sun was still low, and the house was starting to warm up with the light. I opened a window in the living room to let in fresh air, and for a moment, the silence felt less heavy. I could hear faint sounds from the forest, the snap of a twig, a distant bird call. It felt like the place might come alive during the day. I decided to explore the area a bit. The house was perched on a slight hill, and behind it, the forest stretched for miles. There was a narrow trail that looked like it hadn't been used much, just a dirt path covered in fallen leaves and pine needles. I followed it for a while, tried to clear my head. The trees were tall and close together, and the air smelled fresh but damp. After walking about 15 minutes, I came to a small clearing with a stream running through it. The water was clear and cold, trickling over smooth stones. I stayed there for a while, watching the water and listening to the quiet splash of the stream. It felt peaceful, and for a moment I thought maybe this trip would be just what I needed. On my way back, I noticed something strange. The trail I had taken didn't seem to match the map I had printed from the Airbnb listing. The map showed a small pond nearby, but I didn't see it anywhere. Instead, the trail looped back to the house through dense forest, and I realized I'd lost my sense of direction more than once. When I got back, I double-checked the house. All the doors were locked, the windows closed, but I still felt uneasy. The scratching noise was back, this time more persistent. It wasn't coming from the roof or outside. It sounded like it was inside the walls or maybe the ceiling. I tried to ignore it, but every time I sat down, it started again, slow and steady. That evening, I prepared dinner, but I was too distracted to enjoy it. The house felt colder than before, even with the heater running. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. I kept glancing at the windows, feeling like something was watching me from the trees. I know it sounds crazy, but there was a feeling of being followed or stalked that I couldn't shake. Around midnight, I woke to a loud bang. It was sharp and sudden, like someone had slammed a heavy door upstairs. I froze for a moment, listening. The house was still except for the faint creaking of the floorboards. My heart was pounding. I told myself it was probably just the wind knocking something over, but the windows were closed tight. I grabbed my phone and tried to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. No bars at all. I checked the router for the Wi-Fi, but the internet was dead. I felt completely cut off. I moved cautiously toward the stairs, the house groaning under my footsteps. The banging came again, this time softer, like something tapping on the wall. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down the hallway. The scratching sound was louder here. It was coming from the bedroom at the end. My hands trembled as I pushed the door open. The room was empty except for a bed, a dresser, and a small window. The scratching stopped as soon as I entered. I searched the room carefully. Nothing looked out of place, no sign of anything or anyone else. I even checked under the bed. The window was locked tight. I was about to leave when I noticed something on the floor near the closet, a small pile of wood shavings, like someone had been carving or scraping something. I pulled open the closet door, half expecting to find a raccoon or some kind of animal. But the closet was empty except for some old coats and a dusty box. I sat on the bed, trying to calm down, but the feeling of unease didn't leave me. I went back downstairs and locked all the doors again. I stayed up the rest of the night with a flashlight, staring out the windows, listening for any sound. The scratching didn't come back, but the silence was worse. The next morning, I decided I wasn't going to stay longer. I packed up quickly and checked out. As I drove away, I looked back at the house through the rearview mirror. It looked normal in the daylight, just a quiet cabin in the woods. But I knew I'd never come back. It wasn't ghosts or fairy tales that made the place scary. It was the total, suffocating silence, the feeling of being watched, the strange noises that didn't make sense. It was the kind of fear that crawls into your skin when you're all alone and cut off from the world. The house didn't have to be haunted for it to feel wrong. Sometimes, just being so isolated, surrounded by endless trees and no other people, is enough. When I finally got back to the city, I couldn't stop thinking about that house. It was the kind of place where the mind starts playing tricks, where every creak and scratch makes you jump. But I also realized it taught me something. Fear doesn't always come from what you see or hear. Sometimes it's the silence, the emptiness, the unknown waiting just beyond the window. I don't regret going there, even though it was one of the scariest experiences of my life. I learned to trust my instincts, to respect the quiet that's too deep, and to know when to walk away. The Airbnb was just a house in the woods, but for a few days, it was a place that reminded me how real fear can be, without any ghosts or monsters, just the simple, terrifying feeling of being alone in a world that doesn't answer back. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After a long stretch of stressful work and endless noise in the city, I wanted nothing more than a quiet retreat. I found a small cabin tucked away deep in the woods through an Airbnb listing. It was perfect, a rustic wooden cabin surrounded by thick trees, far from any town or road. The photos showed a cozy interior with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and big windows looking out over the forest. No internet, no phone signal, just me and the quiet. I told myself I'd finally get a chance to rest and clear my head. When I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows between the trees. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The driveway was narrow, lined with fallen leaves, and the cabin sat just a short walk off the road. I pulled my bags inside, opened the windows to let in fresh air, and took a moment to breathe in the peacefulness. Everything looked exactly like the pictures. I unpacked slowly, put some food in the fridge, and started a fire in the fireplace. I was already feeling more relaxed. As the sun disappeared and night settled in, I noticed how quiet it was. No cars, no dogs barking, no distant voices. Just the sounds of the woods, leaves rustling, branches tapping against the cabin walls in the wind, and the occasional hoot of an owl. I set up my little reading lamp in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book, and settled in for the evening. But then, around 10 p.m., I started to hear something that didn't belong to the woods. At first, it was faint, almost blending with the creaks and groans of the cabin itself. Footsteps. Soft, slow footsteps crunching on the gravel path outside. I paused and listened. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and then there was a scratching sound like claws or nails dragging along the wood. It didn't sound like an animal. I shivered, but told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other critter. Maybe it was just the wind blowing sticks against the door. I didn't want to let fear ruin my trip, so I ignored it. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows again and tried to distract myself with my book. The scratching continued off and on for maybe an hour. Sometimes it was quiet, sometimes louder. The footsteps came and went. I told myself the cabin was old and made noises, that I was tired and just imagining things. Eventually, I fell asleep with the fire dying down. I woke a few times during the night, heart racing when I thought I heard the footsteps again. But when I looked out the window, no one was there. Just dark trees and empty shadows. The next morning, I planned to make a big breakfast and maybe explore the small trail behind cabin. I felt a little uneasy, but brushed it off as nerves. Then, as I started moving around, I noticed things that didn't add up. The kitchen window was slightly open, even though I was sure I'd closed it before bed. The door to the bedroom was ajar, though I always closed it when I went to sleep. The food I had put in the fridge was moved, a carton of milk shifted to the side, some bread pulled halfway out of the bag. My coffee mug, which I always left on the counter, was now on the table. Most chilling of all, there was a note stuck on the fridge door, written in thick black marker. The words were simple, but made my blood run cold. I was here. I stood frozen, staring at the note. The cabin felt different now. Not quiet, but heavy with something unseen. My mind raced. How could someone get inside? The cabin was supposed to be locked tight, and the host had told me no one else had keys. There was no nearby road to sneak in without me hearing, no neighbors to check on me. I spent the next hour walking through every room, checking every lock and window. Nothing was broken or forced open. Whoever had been inside didn't try to hide. They moved around freely and left that note as a message. It was personal, invasive, like someone wanted me to know they had been in my space, watching me. I wanted to call the host, but there was no cell signal. I looked around for any kind of landline, but the cabin had none. I thought about calling the police, but I was so far out, and without a working phone, I had no way to reach them. The thought that someone could be nearby, maybe still watching, was terrifying. I packed quickly, grabbing everything I could and locking every door behind me. I didn't look back on the way out. The footsteps, the scratching, the note, none of it was the peaceful retreat I had imagined. I drove as fast as I could until I reached a spot with signal and called a friend to come pick me up. I left the cabin and the woods behind, feeling like I had narrowly escaped something dangerous. After I got home, I messaged the Airbnb host to tell them what happened. They insisted no one else had access to the cabin, but I knew what I had found wasn't a mistake or an accident. I changed my locks at home, double-checked my security cameras, and started sleeping with a knife on my nightstand. I still don't know who was in that cabin with me that night, or how they got in without breaking anything. But I do know I was not alone, and whatever it was wanted me to know it had been there. I never went back, and I never rented a cabin in the woods again. The peaceful retreat I wanted turned into a nightmare I couldn't shake, and sometimes, even now, I think about the footsteps outside that door. I was really looking forward to this weekend. After weeks of stress at work, my partner and I decided to get away from the city and book a cozy Airbnb in the countryside. It looked perfect in the pictures, a small, rustic cabin nestled among the trees, with large windows and a warm, inviting living room. The host had great reviews, and the price was reasonable for the area. We wanted a quiet place to relax, cook simple meals, and just get away from all. We arrived late Friday afternoon after a long drive. The sun was already low, casting an orange glow through the pine trees as we pulled up. The cabin sat back from the road, down a narrow gravel driveway that crunched under the tires. There was a small porch with a couple of rocking chairs and a grill off to the side. The air smelled fresh and clean, with hints of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Inside, the place was exactly like the pictures, clean, warm, and well kept. There was a little kitchen with a stove, fridge, and some basic supplies. The living room had a small couch and a wood-burning stove that looked ready for a fire. Upstairs was a loft bedroom with a big bed and soft blankets. We unpacked quickly, then went out to explore the small property, which had a few walking paths through the woods behind the cabin. That first night, everything felt peaceful. We made dinner, drank some wine, and sat on the porch watching the stars come out. It was the kind of quiet that settles into your bones and makes you forget about all the noise and stress of everyday life. We slept well in the soft bed, waking up to birdsong and sunlight streaming through the windows. The next day was even better. We made pancakes in the morning, then took a long walk down the trail behind the cabin. The woods were thick but quiet, except for the occasional rustle of squirrels and the call of a distant hawk. We found a small creek and sat on the rocks, just listening to the water run. It felt like we were the only people in the world. Back at the cabin, we spent the afternoon reading and napping. It was one of those days where time seems to slow down and nothing feels urgent. We cooked dinner again and stayed up late, talking about everything and nothing. It was during that second night that I first noticed the blinking light. We were getting ready for bed, brushing our teeth, and changing into pajamas. I caught a quick flash of red from the smoke detector mounted on the ceiling near the bedroom door. It was faint but definitely there, an almost rhythmic blink every few seconds. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed it was just a battery indicator or a regular test light. Smoke detectors often blink red when the batteries are low or when they're in test mode. But something about the blinking felt off. It wasn't the slow, steady blink I was used to. It was quicker and more mechanical. Curiosity got the better of me. After we went to bed and turned off the lights, I took out my phone and used the flashlight to get a better look. The smoke detector was an older model, but seemed intact. While I moved closer, I noticed the blinking light wasn't coming from the smoke detector's normal LED. Instead, it was from a tiny hole near the edge of the unit. I squinted. It looked like a small lens. I froze for a second. Could it be a camera? I hesitated, but then carefully reached up and removed the smoke detector from the ceiling. It came off easily, and when I held it in my hand, I realized the front panel was a little different from a standard smoke detector. The lens was definitely there, concealed behind a tiny, pinhole-sized black circle. My heart started pounding. Someone had hidden a camera inside the smoke detector. I felt a wave of shock and anger. Who would do this? How long had it been there? Had we been recorded the entire time? I showed my partner immediately. They looked just as disturbed as I felt. We went through the cabin, checking for any other suspicious devices or signs of tampering, but didn't find anything else. I took pictures of the camera, the smoke detector, and the spot where it had been mounted. Then I wrote a detailed message to the host on the Airbnb app, explaining what we'd found and demanding an explanation. I also contacted Airbnb support right away, reporting the hidden camera and requesting a full investigation. The host responded quickly, apologizing and saying they had no idea about the camera. They claimed it must have been installed by a previous guest or contractor and promised to remove it immediately. Airbnb took our report seriously and assured us they would review the listing and take appropriate action. But even with the host's apology and Airbnb's response, the damage was done. The feeling of violation stuck with me. The idea that someone had secretly watched us in what was supposed to be a private space was terrifying. Every time I thought about it, I felt exposed and unsafe. We cut our weekend short and left the cabin the next morning, both of us feeling shaken and unable to relax anymore. The quiet and calm we came for were completely gone. After returning home, I kept replaying everything in my mind, how the camera was so cleverly hidden, how I only noticed it because of the blinking light, how easily someone could have invaded our privacy. I wondered if this was more common than people realized. How many other people had stayed in that cabin without knowing? It took me weeks to stop feeling paranoid in my own home. Every new noise or blinking light made me check for cameras. I even bought a small camera detector to scan rental places I stayed in afterward. Eventually, Airbnb removed the listing and banned the host from their platform after their investigation confirmed the camera's presence and failure to disclose it. But for me, the violation stayed. No apology or refund could undo the sense of being watched and the loss of trust. Looking back, the experience was a hard reminder that even places that seem safe and welcoming can hide dangers. It's made me far more cautious about where I stay and what I look for. And I never ignore blinking lights on smoke detectors anymore. I arrived in the city late in the afternoon, tired from a long train ride and looking forward to the quiet week I had planned. The Airbnb apartment I had booked was supposed to be a cozy, affordable spot right in the heart of downtown. The listing had promised clean, modern space, close to restaurants and shops, with plenty of natural light and all the basic comforts I'd need for my stay. The photos showed bright rooms with white walls, a tidy kitchen, and a small balcony with a view of the street below. Everything looked perfect online, but as soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The door creaked open on rusty hinges, and the smell hit me first. It was a thick, wet stench, like something old and rotten mixed with damp dirt. I stood in the narrow hallway for a moment, trying to understand what it was, but it only got worse the deeper I went. The light bulbs flickered weakly, and the air felt heavy and thick, making it hard to breathe. The walls, which should have been white and clean, were covered in dark patches. I soon realized it was black mold, thick, patchy, and spreading all over the corners of the ceiling and along the baseboards. The smell must have been coming from a mold. I had heard about black mold before and knew it could be dangerous. The place looked like it hadn't been cleaned in months, maybe years. I stepped cautiously into the living room. The floor was sticky and the old carpet was stained with dark spots I didn't want to look at too closely. Near the windows, I noticed the curtains were torn and yellowed, hanging limply with dust and grime covering the rods. The windows themselves were filthy, and outside, the view was just a wall of brick from the building across the alley. Nothing like the bright, open scene the photos had shown. Then I saw them, cockroaches. At first, just one or two scurried across the floor near the kitchen doorway. But then I noticed more. They crawled over the counters, the sink, even the bathroom sink and toilet seat. The kitchen looked like it had been ignored for a long time. The sink was clogged and filled with dirty water and leftover scraps of food. The fridge was open, its door hanging loose, and inside, the shelves were broken and covered with a thick layer of grime. I looked around for the garbage bin and found it overflowing with old food wrappers and moldy leftovers. The smell came from there too, a rotten, sour smell that made my stomach turn. There was no way anyone had lived here recently and kept it this dirty without noticing. Whoever had been responsible for cleaning this place was either cruel or just didn't care. The bathroom was the worst. The shower curtain was yellowed with age and mildew, the tiles covered with black mold creeping up the grout lines like veins. The toilet had stains, and the floor was sticky with an unknown liquid. The mirror was cracked, and the small bathroom fan was broken, leaving the whole room feeling damp and suffocating. I pulled out my phone and looked back at the photos on the Airbnb app. The pictures online were bright and clean. They didn't show any mold or cockroaches. The kitchen looked spotless, the bathroom fresh and white. The listing had clearly been doctored to hide the true condition of the apartment. I tried to remain calm. I messaged the host immediately, explaining the situation and asking for a refund. I made it clear that I could not stay in such a filthy and unhealthy environment. But no matter how many messages I sent, I got no real reply. A few automated responses, then silence. I checked for other places to stay nearby, but everything was fully booked or far too expensive at the last minute. It was late, and I had nowhere else to go. The city was unfamiliar to me, and I didn't want to end up wandering the streets with my bags. I was stuck. I told myself I'd just have to tough it out for one night and find a way to leave first thing in the morning. But the thought of sleeping in that place made me feel sick. I took out my bag and tried to unpack, but I was too distracted by the cockroaches crawling on the counter and the constant, unbearable smell. I looked for clean spots, places I could sit or lie down without touching the floor or walls, but there were none. Even the couch was covered in stains and looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. I didn't want to sit there, knowing it was probably crawling with insects too. I found a blanket in one of the drawers, but it smelled musty and damp. I considered putting it on the bed just to have some barrier between me and the sheets, but I was afraid of what might be hiding in the fabric. I didn't know if it had been washed in months or years. The bed itself looked worse than the couch. The mattress had stains all over and smelled like mold and sweat. I tried to clean a small spot on the floor with some paper towels, but they came up black and soggy. The water I found in the kitchen sink was dirty and cloudy. I didn't want to risk drinking or washing with it. I had brought a bottle of water with me, so at least I could stay hydrated. The cockroaches didn't stop moving. They crawled over the counters, the floor, the sink, the toilet. I saw one large one disappear behind the refrigerator and another one climb the wall near the bathroom. It felt like they were everywhere. I kept swatting them away, but they seemed endless. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, sitting on my suitcase in the corner of the room, too nervous and uncomfortable to rest. Every small noise made me jump. The creaking of the pipes, the faint hum of the city outside, the soft scuttling of the cockroaches. The air was so thick with mold spores and the smell of rot that I had to keep the windows slightly open despite the noise outside. My skin itched constantly, and I could feel my throat getting sore from breathing in that foul air. I was scared I might get sick from just being in there. I thought about calling someone for help or finding a hotel, but the few places that had availability were miles away and out of my budget. Morning came slowly, bringing a faint gray light through the grimy windows. The cockroaches had settled down a little, but the mold and dirt were still there, unchanged. I packed my things quickly, not wanting to touch anything more than necessary. I left a detailed review on the Airbnb app, sharing every detail about the mold, the cockroaches, the smell, the dirt, and the photos being fake. I warned other travelers not to book the place. Then I found a cheap hostel nearby and moved there, grateful for clean sheets and a hot shower. Looking back, it was one of the worst nights I've ever spent in any city. The experience taught me to always read reviews carefully, ask for recent photos, and never ignore the gut feeling that something isn't right. That apartment was a nightmare, but at least I got out of there without getting seriously sick or hurt. And that made all the difference. We had been looking forward to this family trip for months. After a year full of work and school, finally getting away for a full week felt like a dream. We found a big house through Airbnb. It was exactly what we wanted. Lots of space for everyone, a large kitchen, a huge living room with a fireplace, and a big yard. The picture showed it was a quiet, beautiful place on the edge of a small town, surrounded by woods, but still close enough to a grocery store and gas stations. The host assured us it was a private rental. No one else was supposed to be there. We planned the trip carefully. I double-checked the address, the arrival instructions, and the parking situation. The house was about a 4-hour drive from where we lived, so we left early in the morning, hoping to get there by afternoon, unpack, and start relaxing. But the traffic was worse than expected. A few accidents slowed us down, and a detour added more time. By the time we reached the town, it was already dusk. We drove up the long gravel driveway under tall pine trees, the branches making shadows in the car headlights. The house looked bigger and more welcoming in real life than in the photos. The porch light was on, and I felt a small flicker of relief. We parked, grabbed our bags, and headed inside. The air smelled like wood and something faintly like old carpet. The floorboards creaked as we walked through the hall. We were all tired, me, my wife, and the 2 kids, so I didn't want to waste time unpacking. I opened the big front door wide and started carrying in bags. The kids dropped their backpacks in the corner and looked around with wide eyes. The walls were painted a warm beige, the furniture old but sturdy, and the windows were covered with heavy curtains that blocked out the night. We set down our things in the living room. My wife pulled out some snacks, and the kids grabbed some juice boxes. I went over to the kitchen to check the fridge and cupboards. It was stocked with basic items: milk, eggs, some bread, a few cans of soup. There was a note from the host on the counter saying to make ourselves at home and a reminder about the checkout time. As I was putting groceries away, I heard a faint noise from upstairs. It sounded like footsteps or maybe someone shifting in a bed. I froze. We were supposed to have the whole house to ourselves. I called out, but no one answered. The kids looked up, their faces suddenly a little scared. My wife came into the kitchen, asking what was wrong. I told her I heard something. She shrugged, trying to stay calm. Maybe it was an animal or the house settling, she said. But the sound came again, louder this time. A soft creak followed by a rustle, like sheets being moved. I told her I was going to check it out. I took a flashlight from the drawer and headed toward the stairs. The old wooden steps groaned under my weight. I tried to keep my voice steady as I called out again, but there was no reply. At the top, the hallway stretched out with doors on each side. The light from the flashlight bounced off the peeling wallpaper and the slightly warped floor. I reached the last bedroom door on the right and noticed it was cracked open just a little. My heart was pounding. I pushed the door slowly. Inside, a man was lying on one of the beds, wide awake and staring at me. He was older, maybe in his 50s, wearing a wrinkled shirt and jeans. The room smelled musty, like it hadn't been cleaned in a while. He looked calm, almost bored. I stepped back, shocked. I asked him what he was doing there. He said the host had told him it was okay for him to stay. I didn't believe it. I asked if he knew the family who booked the place, and he shook his head. I hurried downstairs and told my wife and kids to pack up immediately. I called the host, but the phone went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again, but no answer. We grabbed our bags and left as fast as we could, locking the door behind us. We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I reported what happened to Airbnb and the local police. The police said the man had been caught before trying to stay in rental homes without permission, sometimes pretending he was allowed. The host apparently didn't tell us about him, maybe to avoid losing bookings. We never went back to that house. We canceled the rest of our trip and rented a hotel instead. Every time I think about that night, I still feel the chill of knowing someone was inside the house, uninvited, watching us without us realizing it. The day we arrived at the Victorian house, my partner and I were full of excitement. We'd found it online, a beautiful old home, all woodwork and stained glass windows, with a porch that wrapped around the front. The photos made it look charming, the kind of place that held stories in its walls. The listing said it was quiet in a small town with a friendly neighborhood, perfect for a weekend getaway. We've been working too hard, and this felt like the perfect chance to get away from the city's noise and stress. When we pulled up, the house looked even better than in the pictures. It was tall, with peeling paint that gave it character rather than neglect. Ivy crawled up one side, and a large oak tree stood proudly in the front yard, its branches casting shadows on the porch. The driveway was narrow, made of cracked concrete, and a rusty gate squeaked as we pushed it open. We parked the car and stepped onto the porch, the wooden floorboards creaking under our feet. The front door was painted dark green, with a brass handle that had dulled over time, but still looked sturdy. The inside smelled of old wood and faintly of dust. The floor was covered in thick rugs, and the walls were lined with wallpaper in muted floral patterns, slightly faded and peeling at the edges. We noticed the high ceilings right away, with decorative molding and chandeliers that looked like they'd seen better days. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak from the wood, which we blamed on the old construction settling. We spent the first hour unpacking and exploring the rooms. The living room was large with a fireplace, though the hearth was cold and empty. There were bookshelves filled with dusty books and some old photographs framed on the walls, mostly of people from long ago, dressed in clothes that looked like they were from the early 1900s. The kitchen was small but functional, with a worn wooden table and mismatched chairs. The windows were old and thick, with slightly warped glass that made the light outside shimmer strangely. That first night, we slept in a master bedroom upstairs. The bed was a big four-poster with heavy curtains, and the room had its own bathroom with a clawfoot tub. We felt cozy at first, happy to be away from our usual routines. But then things started to feel off. It began with the doors. Not all of them, but a few, mostly the ones on the second floor. We'd hear creaks and soft thuds late at night. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the wood expanding or contracting with the temperature change. But then, a door would be slightly open in the morning, even though we closed every door tightly before bed. It wasn't just one door either. Sometimes the door to the guest bedroom was cracked open, sometimes the bathroom door downstairs, even the pantry. One night, I woke up because I heard footsteps. They were soft but deliberate, coming from the hallway outside our bedroom. My partner was asleep beside me, so I didn't want to wake them, but I sat up quietly and listened. The footsteps moved down the hall, pausing outside the guest room, then down the stairs. I heard nothing after that, just the usual creaks and groans. I told myself it was probably the old house settling, maybe an animal on the porch. The next day, I found scuff marks on the wooden floor near the staircase. They looked fresh, like something heavy had been dragged across the boards. The walls near the stairs had scratches too, long thin lines that hadn't been there the day before. I showed my partner, but they shrugged it off, saying it was probably from the previous renters or just natural wear and tear. Later, while cooking in the kitchen, I heard whispers. It was so faint at first that I thought it was the wind outside or maybe the sound of the trees brushing against the windows. But then it got clearer, a low murmur like someone talking just out of earshot. I stopped what I was doing and listened closely. The sound seemed to come from the hallway leading to the back of the house. I grabbed a flashlight and walked down the hall, checking every room. No one was there. The whispering stopped. That night was worse. We had both fallen asleep early, exhausted from the day's drive and unpacking. Around 2 a.m., I was startled awake by the sound of a door creaking open slowly. It was the guest bedroom door at the end of the hallway. I sat up and saw it swinging gently, as if pushed by a breeze. But all the windows were shut tight, and the house was still. I got out of bed and walked down the hall. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and the air felt colder, even though the thermostat was set the same as it had been all day. I reached the guest bedroom and pushed the door closed. I checked the windows, shut the blinds, and even put a chair in front of the door to keep it from moving. Then I went back to bed, feeling uneasy but trying to ignore it. We tried to laugh it off the next morning, telling ourselves old houses have noises and drafts. But the feeling didn't leave. The atmosphere in the house was heavy and silent in a way that made it hard to relax. The furniture seemed too still, the shadows too dark. In the afternoon, I walked outside to stretch my legs and maybe talk to some neighbors. I noticed a few people working in their yards, and one older woman came out onto her porch as I passed. I asked about the house, just small talk really, hoping to learn about the neighborhood or any local tips. She hesitated, looking at the house with a strange expression. Then, quietly, she told me that a guest who had rented the house a few months before had died there under mysterious circumstances. The police had never fully explained it, but the guest was found in the living room one morning with no clear cause of death. No signs of struggle, no drugs or alcohol involved. Just gone. The house had been empty since. She didn't say much more, but I could tell it was something people didn't like to talk about. I thanked her and walked back to the house, feeling a chill that wasn't from the spring air. That evening, the strange things got worse. The footsteps came again, louder this time, walking from the stairs into the hall, then to the kitchen, then back upstairs. Doors creaked open and closed on their own, sometimes suddenly, waking us up with sharp noises. We stayed together in the master bedroom, locking the door and even wedging a chair under the handle. But even then, we heard noises, whispers, faint knocking on the walls, and that dragging sound from stairs. We started packing late that night. Neither of us spoke much. We moved quickly, trying to finish before dawn. The house felt alive with tension, like it was watching us. When we finally left, the early morning sky was just starting to brighten. We didn't look back at the Victorian home. We drove away in silence, both of us relieved to be gone. The next day, we contacted the Airbnb host to explain why we left early. The host apologized and said they had no idea about the previous guest's death until recently. They promised a full refund and said they would take the house off the rental market to investigate. We didn't return. The whole experience left a mark on me. I'm still not sure what caused the strange noises or why the doors moved on their own, but I know I never want to stay in that house again. Looking back, the house itself wasn't haunted by ghosts or anything supernatural. The strange sounds and movements were probably due to its age, creaky wood, old pipes, and drafts sneaking through cracks. The whispers might have been the wind moving through broken shutters or distant voices from the street mixing with echoes inside. But knowing a person died there so suddenly and mysteriously made every sound feel heavy with meaning. It was as if the house held on to that tension and we were just passing through it for a while. Sometimes when I'm in old houses or buildings, I think about that place, how silence can be louder than noise, how emptiness can feel like a presence. That weekend made me realize that old houses carry history not just in pictures or furniture, but in the very way they breathe and settle around us. I still get chills thinking about it, but I also understand now why people say some places just don't feel right. It wasn't ghosts or curses, just the weight of a sudden, unexplained death in a quiet house that held its secrets tight. And sometimes that's scarier than anything else. I've been planning this trip for months. It was supposed to be a relaxing break from work, a chance to explore a new city I'd never been to before. I booked my Airbnb early, almost 6 months ahead, to make sure I got the perfect spot. It was a small, cozy apartment right in the heart of downtown. The pictures looked great, the reviews were good, and the price was reasonable for the area. I had arranged everything around this booking: flights, transport, even some events I wanted to attend near the place. I felt confident everything would go smoothly. Then, a few days before my arrival, I got the email that changed everything. The host canceled my reservation. No explanation, no apology, just a simple notification that my booking was no longer valid. I stared at my phone in disbelief. How could this happen? I had been so careful, so early. I checked the date again and again, thinking maybe I had misunderstood. But no, it was clear. The host had canceled. Panic started to set in immediately. The city I was going to visit was known to be busy, especially this time of year. Hotels were mostly booked solid, and prices were already high because of a convention happening downtown. I opened the Airbnb app, searching desperately for another place. But the listings I found were either way out of my budget or already taken. I felt my heart race as I realized how limited my options were. I spent hours scrolling through the app, refreshing the page, hoping for something to open up. Finally, a small room popped up. Barely a room, really just a tiny bed in a shared apartment. The price was 3 times what I had paid for the original place. I hesitated, but knew I didn't have much choice. I booked it quickly, almost choking on the price. I kept telling myself it was better than nothing. But deep down, I knew this was going to change everything about my trip. The day I arrived, I was exhausted from the flight and all the stress leading up to this moment. When I finally reached the new place, it was nothing like the photos. The building looked old and worn down, with flickering lights in the hallway. The apartment itself was cramped, cluttered, and smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and something musty I couldn't quite place. The bed was small, the linens threadbare, and the walls paper thin. I could hear every creak and cough in the other rooms. I tried to push aside the disappointment and told myself it was just one night. But the nights stretched on and the problems grew worse. The heating barely worked, leaving the room cold and uncomfortable. The bathroom was shared with other tenants who seemed to come and go at all hours, making noise and sometimes leaving a mess. The Wi-Fi was unreliable, dropping out just when I needed it most. I had to constantly recharge my phone and laptop in the shared kitchen area, which was often crowded and noisy. Every day, I felt more stressed and frustrated. My plans were falling apart because of the unexpected costs and discomfort. I had to cancel some events because I was too tired or the transportation time from the apartment was longer than I expected. I felt isolated in a strange city, stuck in a place I never wanted to be. To make matters worse, the host of this second Airbnb was hard to reach. Messages took hours or sometimes days to get a reply. Well, I did get a response. It was often vague or unhelpful. I asked for basic things like extra blankets or a cleaner bathroom, but nothing really changed. I started to feel trapped. I spent the last few days counting down the hours until I could leave. The city itself was beautiful, with vibrant streets and interesting places to visit. But I couldn't enjoy it because I was always worried about where I would sleep or how much more money this trip was costing me. What was supposed to be a fun escape had turned into a stressful nightmare. On the final day, as I packed my bags, I thought about everything that had happened. The canceled booking, the frantic search for a new place, the uncomfortable nights, and the frustration of losing money and time. I realized how easily plans can fall apart and how much of a gamble it is to rely on these online services, especially when things go wrong at the last minute. Even though the trip didn't go as planned, I was glad to be leaving. I had learned a hard lesson about always having a backup plan, about not putting all my trust in a single booking, and about how unpredictable travel can be. I promised myself to always book refundable options in the future or have a list of alternative places ready, just in case. The trip ended with me catching a taxi to the airport, exhausted but relieved. I was ready to go home, to a place where I could sleep peacefully without worry. This experience didn't ruin my love for travel, but it reminded me that no matter how carefully you plan, sometimes things just don't go your way, and the best you can do is adapt and keep moving forward. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to get scared while camping. I've been out in the woods alone plenty of times before, hiking, sleeping in a tent, cooking over a fire, and just enjoying the quiet. The forest always felt peaceful, even comforting. But this trip, the one I took last fall, changed all that. I picked a small state park that was known for being quiet and not too crowded. It was late September, early fall. The nights were chilly, with that crispness that makes you pull your sleeping bag tighter. The trees had started to turn orange and yellow, but most were still green. The park had only a few campsites open, and I ended up at the back end of the loop, where the woods were thick and the sounds of other campers were distant and faint. The perfect spot, I thought. I arrived mid-afternoon, unloaded my gear, and set up my tent on a flat patch just off a dirt road. The ground was covered with pine needles and dry leaves. There was a small creek, maybe 50 yards away, and the sun filtered through the canopy in soft golden light. The air smelled like damp earth and wood smoke from other campers' fires. I was alone as I had planned. No phone signal, no internet, just me in the woods. The first night was quiet. I cooked some instant soup on my little stove, stretched out in my sleeping bag, and listened to the night sounds, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs from squirrels or raccoons. I didn't hear anything unusual, just the natural noises you expect in the woods. I fell asleep easily. Then, on the second night, around 2 a.m., I woke up. It wasn't a loud noise, just a faint rustling sound near the tent flap. I lay very still, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I told myself it was just the wind or a branch brushing against the tent. Maybe a small animal trying to get close, looking for food. But when I opened my eyes and looked toward the flap, the movement stopped. No shadow, no figure, nothing. Just the slight flutter of the fabric. I kept my eyes on the flap for a while, but there was nothing more. I eventually drifted back to sleep, convincing myself I was just being jumpy. The next day, I thought about what had happened. I checked the campsite, looked around for signs of animals or people. No footprints near the tent flap, no broken branches, nothing out of place. The park was supposed to be safe. I told myself it was nothing. The third night, it happened again. At almost exactly 2 a.m., the tent flap rustled as if someone was peeking inside. I froze. I sat up slowly, my eyes locked on the moving fabric. The moon was behind some clouds, so I couldn't see clearly, but the outline of the tent flap shifted as if being pushed lightly. Still, no figure, no shadow, nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, pointed it toward the flap, and shone it outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty ground just outside the tent. Nothing. No one was there. I stayed awake for a long time after that, waiting for something to happen, but it never did. The next day, I told myself to stay alert. I thought maybe a curious person was wandering near the camp after hours. I was alone and didn't want anyone sneaking up on me or trying to mess with me. The fourth night was the worst. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again to the sound of the tent flap moving. This time, it wasn't just a little rustle. It sounded like someone was pushing it open slowly, deliberately. My heart slammed against my chest. I grabbed my small pocket knife that I kept near my sleeping bag and sat up fully. I looked toward the opening. The flap was moving, and then I saw it, barely, but the flap was wide open, the dark night outside spilling into the tent. I quickly shone my flashlight toward the opening. The breeze had pushed the flap back, but there was still no one there. I stood up slowly, keeping my knife in hand, and looked around my small tent. No sign of anyone. The moon had come out from behind the clouds and lit the forest floor outside. I stepped out carefully to look around, checking the perimeter of my sight. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. I shut the flap tightly, zipped it closed, and went back inside, locking the tent poles in place the best I could. The next day, I searched more carefully around the campsite. I looked for tracks, scuffed dirt, anything. I found some deer tracks and a few raccoon prints near my cooler, but no human footprints. It didn't make sense. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept the flashlight and knife close. I stayed awake until almost 3 a.m., but nothing moved outside the tent. The fifth night was when things got really strange. I had just fallen asleep when I heard the flap again. I woke up fully, heart pounding. This time, the flap wasn't just rustling. It was wide open. The cold night air blew inside, and I could see the trees silhouetted against the moonlight. I sat up fast and grabbed my flashlight. I scanned the ground inside the tent and spotted something lying near my sleeping bag. It was a photo. I picked it up slowly and shone the flashlight on it. It was a picture of me sleeping inside the tent. The photo was taken from the inside. I was curled up on my side, eyes closed, unaware. I dropped the photo in shock and looked around frantically. The flap was wide open, and someone had clearly been inside the tent while I slept. I froze. My mind raced. How could someone get inside without me hearing? I hadn't noticed any sounds except the flap. I'd slept deeply until the noise woke me. I zipped the tent closed as fast as I could, but now the feeling of safety was gone. I sat in the dark, clutching the photo, thinking about who could have done this. There was no one camping close enough to explain it. The park was nearly empty, and I hadn't heard anyone walking near me after dark. The thought that someone had been so close, watching me sleep, terrified me. I wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but it was still the middle of the night. I didn't want to walk alone in the dark through the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the knife, flashlight, and the photo. When dawn finally came, I packed up as fast as I could. I double-checked everything, stuffed the photo in my backpack, and hurried down the dirt road toward the park exit. On the way out, I thought about calling the park rangers, but I wasn't sure what I could say. They might think I was crazy. I didn't have proof besides the photo, and I didn't know who could have done it or why. Back home, I developed the photo to see if it gave me any clues. The quality wasn't great. It looked like it was taken on a phone camera with low light, but I could make out the shape of someone's hand holding the phone near the flap of the tent. I looked closely at the shadows and edges and spotted a faint outline near the tent's opening. It was someone crouching just outside, their face hidden behind the tent fabric. That's when I realized this wasn't an accident or a prank. Someone had been stalking me in the woods. They had slipped in and out of my campsite quietly every night around the same time, taking pictures, watching me sleep, and disappearing without a sound. I never went back to that park. I reported the incident to the park authorities and the local police. They said they would increase patrols at night, but they never found who did it. I kept the photo, a reminder that out in the woods, no matter how safe it feels, there can be someone watching. Since then, I've learned to trust my instincts more, to camp where others can hear or see me, and to always keep my gear close. The woods can be peaceful, but sometimes the quiet hides things far more unsettling than animals or the wind. The night had fallen deep and thick, settling over the forest like a heavy blanket. I was alone in my campsite, tucked away in a remote part of the woods I'd found after a long hike that day. The small fire I'd built was nearly dead, just a few glowing embers struggling against the cold, dark air. I'd already eaten my dinner, dried out my wet socks by the flames, and settled into my sleeping bag inside my tent. Everything was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on you until even the smallest sound feels loud. I lay there listening, my mind starting to wander, when I heard it, soft whispers, so faint I thought I was imagining them. At first, it was just a vague murmur, like the wind brushing through the leaves. But then I heard it clearly. Someone was calling my name. Not shouting or urgent, just a low, breathy whisper that seemed to drift from somewhere deep in the trees around me. The voice wasn't loud or sharp. It was smooth, almost gentle, but it cut through the silence like a knife. I froze, staring out through the mesh of my tent, my heart beating fast. The voice called again softly, "Chris." It was my name, unmistakably. I swallowed hard, feeling a cold sweat on my back, and for a moment I wanted to just stay silent and wait for whatever it was to pass. But then my curiosity got the better of me. I leaned out of the tent, peering into the darkness beyond the small circle of light from my dying fire. The woods stretched in all directions, shadowed and still, tall trees standing like silent sentinels. I called back, my voice low but steady. "Who's there?" That's when it happened. The voice answered, but it wasn't just calling my name anymore. It spoke back in my own voice. It wasn't someone else's voice trying to sound like me. It was exactly like I was speaking, perfectly mimicked, almost like an echo of myself. The whisper was so close, so clear, it sent a shock through me that tightened my chest. I sat back, pulling the tent flap closed, suddenly feeling like I was not alone. I told myself it must be my own voice playing tricks on me. The wind, maybe, or the way the forest carries sound through the trees. I've heard about those natural echoes before. Sometimes voices can bounce weirdly in the woods. But this was different. It was too exact, too deliberate. The fire flickered out, leaving only the faint silver light of the moon filtering through the branches. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my boots crunching on dry leaves. The forest was alive with night sounds. The rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl, the snap of a twig breaking somewhere nearby. But none of those made me jump like the whispering did. I called my name again, louder this time, and the voice answered with my words, exactly as I'd said them, repeating my own voice back to me. It wasn't a reply, not really. It was more like my voice trapped and thrown back at me from the dark. I shone my flashlight into the trees, spinning slowly, trying to catch sight of anyone or anything that might be hiding there. The light caught the rough bark of trees, the thick tangle of bushes, but nothing moved. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding, trying to understand what I was hearing. The forest seemed to hold its breath with me, every sound suddenly sharper. Then I noticed something strange. When I moved, the voice would move too, always keeping the same distance from me, repeating what I said but delayed, like it was always just behind me, always copying. It felt like I was in a trap, like the forest itself was holding a mirror to my voice. I tried not to panic, but the unease grew heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not supernatural, but deeply, unnervingly wrong. I decided to pack up and leave. I grabbed my pack, stuffed the tent into its bag, and started walking down the trail back to my car. The moon was behind clouds now, and the forest was darker than ever. I kept my flashlight in front of me, swinging it left and right, ears straining for any sign of footsteps or another voice. But the whispers followed me. Every time I called out, the voice returned. It didn't say anything new. It just repeated my words, always in my own voice. When I said, "Who's there?" the answer was always my own voice, exactly the same, just a few seconds later. It was like a broken tape recorder stuck in a loop. The sound echoed from every direction, but no source appeared. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe it was some kind of trick of the wind or the way the trees shaped sound, or maybe a prank from another camper. But I was miles from the nearest campground, and I hadn't seen anyone else all day. No footprints on the trail, no sign of another human anywhere. As I walked, I started noticing other things. My footsteps sounded different, heavier but not mine. When I glanced behind, there was nothing there. Yet the whispers were always there, matching my calls. I stopped at a small clearing and sat on a fallen log, tried to calm down. The cold air was biting in my skin, and my breath came out in small clouds. I felt like I was losing my mind. Then I realized something. The voice wasn't just copying me. It was anticipating me. Every time I hesitated, the voice would start repeating what I was about to say before I even said it. I thought maybe my brain was playing tricks, but the timing was too exact. I felt trapped in a strange kind of silence, where the forest wasn't quiet, but filled with the sound of my own voice, distorted and stretched. It was like I was being followed by a shadow of myself, a copy that could speak but had no body. The next hour was the worst. I tried to ignore the voice, but it only grew louder in the silence. I stopped talking altogether, hoping the whisper would go away if I stayed quiet. But the forest seemed to fill with a soft murmur anyway, like the sound of dozens of me whispering, calling my name from the darkness. My mind raced, looking for an explanation. I thought maybe I was overheated or dehydrated. The isolation, the stress, the long hike. Maybe I was hallucinating. I'd heard of something like that before. When your brain is pushed too far, it can create voices, repeat sounds, or make you hear things that aren't there. I forced myself to focus on the trail, putting one foot in front of the other, heading back toward the car. The whispers slowed and faded when I started moving faster, but they never stopped completely. When I finally reached the edge of the forest where the trees opened to the gravel road leading to the parking lot, the voice stopped. The silence that followed was sharp and sudden, like a door closing behind me. I looked back into the trees, half expecting to see something standing there, waiting. But there was nothing. Just dark trunks and shadows. Back in my car, I sat inside, breathing hard, trying to steady my nerves. I checked my phone. No signal, of course. I sat there for a long time, trying to understand what had happened. The next day, I talked to a ranger at the park entrance. I told him about the whispers, about the voice that sounded like me repeating everything I said. He nodded slowly, and then explained something that made everything clearer. He said the area I camped in was known for its acoustic oddities. The way the forest was shaped, the hills, the rocks, the density of the trees, could cause sounds to bounce and echo in strange ways. Sometimes, voices would carry and loop around the hills, creating what sounded like someone answering you from the woods. People sometimes thought it was a spirit or something supernatural, but it was really just nature playing tricks on sound. He told me that people had reported hearing their own voices echoed back to them, sometimes delayed, sometimes slightly distorted. It was easy to get spooked, especially at night when your mind was already on edge. He said the whispering wasn't real in the sense of a person being there. It was just sound waves bouncing back to me, carrying my own voice in a strange loop through the trees. Hearing that made me feel a little better, but it also made the whole thing feel even more eerie. It wasn't a ghost or a creature. It was just me, trapped in a strange echo chamber of my own voice. That night in the forest wasn't supernatural, but it was one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had. It reminded me how easily our minds can be tricked by nature when we're tired, alone, and surrounded by the unknown. The woods don't need monsters to be scary. Sometimes all it takes is your own voice coming back to you from the dark, calling your name in a whisper that sounds like you, but isn't quite right. After that, I never camped in that part of the forest again. Even now, when I think about it, I can still hear that whisper in my head, soft and close, like a shadow of myself just out of reach. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet getaway. I found it online, a small place deep in the woods, far from anything. No neighbors for miles, no cell service, just nature and silence. It sounded perfect. I needed a break from the noise of the city, the constant buzz of people and traffic. Just a few days alone, some fresh air, and maybe a good hike. I told myself I'd take my time, slow down, and enjoy the peace. When I arrived, the sun was already dipping low behind the trees. The gravel road leading to the cabin was narrow, twisting, and lined with tall pines that blocked most of the sky. The air smelled like pine needles and wet earth. It was cool, early fall, and the leaves were just starting to turn. Yellow and orange mixed with green, the forest looked alive and quiet at the same time. The cabin was small, built from old logs that had darkened with age. It sat on a slight rise, looking out over a clearing where the grass had grown long and wild. A small porch wrapped around the front, the wood creaking under my feet as I stepped inside. The place smelled like damp wood and something faintly like old smoke. The fireplace was stone, big and old, with ashes still in the hearth. The floor was rough wood, scratched and worn. The furniture was sparse, a table and a couple of chairs, a small bed pushed into a corner, and a metal stove for cooking. I dropped my pack and opened a window to let in fresh air. The sun was nearly gone now, and the forest outside grew darker, the shadows thickening. I could hear the wind in the trees, a soft but steady sound, and far off the occasional bird call. No cars, no voices, just nature. I unpacked a few things, a book, some food, and my flashlight. I lit the stove and made a simple meal, the warm glow filling the room. Outside, the wind picked up a little, rustling the leaves and making the cabin creak softly. It wasn't cold yet, but I added some wood to the fire just in case. After eating, I sat by the window, watching as the forest grew darker. The last light faded quickly, replaced by deep blue shadows. The stars started to appear, small pinpricks of light scattered across the sky. It was beautiful and peaceful. I thought about how far away I was from everything. No distractions, no noise, just the woods and me. I went to bed early, tired from the drive. The bed was stiff and not very comfortable, but it was warm enough. I left the fire burning low in the stove, the glow barely lighting the room. Outside, the wind sounded stronger now, whistling through the trees and pushing branches against the cabin walls. It was the kind of night that felt alive, like the forest was breathing around me. I didn't sleep well. Every little noise seemed louder in the dark. The creak of the wood, the scrape of branches, the snap of twigs. I kept thinking I heard something moving just outside the window, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just the wind and my imagination. The next morning, I woke early. The sun was just starting to filter through the trees, casting long beams of light across the floor. I made coffee on the stove and ate a quick breakfast. Outside, the forest looked calm and bright, the air fresh with the scent of pine and damp earth. I decided to take a hike to stretch my legs. I packed a small bag with water, some snacks, and my phone, though I knew there was no signal, and headed out. The trail was narrow and rough, winding through the trees and up a small hill. The ground was soft and covered with fallen leaves. I walked slowly, listening to the sounds of the forest, birds, squirrels, the rustle of the wind. The sunlight filtered through the branches, creating patterns on ground. About an hour in, I came to a small stream. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones. I knelt to take a drink and rested for a moment, watching the water flow. The forest was still, almost too quiet. No birds, no animals, just the sound of the stream and the wind in the leaves. It felt peaceful, but there was also something strange about the silence. I stood up and continued on the trail, but as I walked, I noticed the trees looked different. The bark was rougher, the branches twisted in odd shapes. The light was dimmer here, the forest thicker and darker. The path narrowed and became harder to follow. I kept going, telling myself I'd turn back soon. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. It was soft, like a footstep on dry leaves. I stopped and listened. The forest was quiet again. I took a few steps forward, then the noise came again, closer this time. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. Just trees and shadows. I started walking faster, heart pounding. The trail became less clear, covered with sticks and leaves. I tripped over a root and fell hard onto the ground. My hands scraped against the dirt and rocks, and I tasted blood. I sat up, breathing hard, and looked around. The forest seemed darker, the trees closing in. I stood up and decided to head back. The noise came again, but this time it wasn't footsteps. It was a low rustling, like something moving through the bushes. I shone my flashlight into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw eyes reflecting the light, but when I blinked, they were gone. I started running, following the trail as best as I could. The wind whipped through the branches, and the sound of the rustling got louder, chasing me. My legs ached. My breath came fast and shallow. I didn't look back. I just kept running. After what felt like forever, I broke through the trees and saw the clearing where the cabin sat. The porch light was still on, the small fire burning in the stove, glowing warmly through the window. I stumbled up the steps and locked the door behind me. Inside, I leaned against the door, panting and sweating. My hands were shaking. I looked out the window, but the forest was quiet again. No rustling, no movement, just the wind in the trees. I checked the locks and closed all the windows. I grabbed a knife from my pack, something sharp and heavy, and sat by the fire. The night stretched on slowly, each minute feeling longer than the last. I kept listening, waiting for any sound. Around midnight, the wind died down. The forest outside was still and silent. I felt myself relax a little, but I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. When the sun came up, I opened the door and stepped outside. The forest looked peaceful, just like before. No sign of anything strange. I packed my things quickly and left the cabin that morning. The drive back was quiet. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, surrounded by cars and noise. The city felt loud and overwhelming, but safe. I never went back to that cabin. The memory of the night stayed with me. The feeling of being watched, the silence that wasn't really silence, the strange rustling in the dark. It wasn't ghosts or monsters, just the wild, unpredictable forest. And sometimes, that's more frightening than anything else. I was driving alone on a mountain road late at night. The kind of road where there are no street lights, no houses, and barely any other cars. Just sharp turns, tall pine trees pressing in on both sides, and the distant sound of wind through the branches. I'd been on this route a few times before, but never this late and never alone. The night was quiet except for the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the occasional crackle of the radio, which I kept low to avoid feeling too alone. The road was narrow and winding, climbing higher as it twisted through the mountain. I had my headlights on, cutting bright white beams through the dark. The beam bounced off the yellow lines, the trees, the guardrails that showed me the edge of the road. I knew the bends well, so I kept my speed steady, slow enough to handle the sharp turns, but fast enough to keep moving without too much tension building inside me. About 20 minutes in, as I was coming around a long right bend, I caught the flicker of another vehicle's taillights in my rearview mirror. It was far behind, maybe a quarter of a mile back. I barely noticed it at first, thinking it was just someone else driving the same road. But as the minutes passed, the red glow didn't get smaller. It stayed the same size, like that vehicle was keeping pace with me no matter what I did. I glanced over my shoulder several times. The car behind me didn't have its headlights on. There were no bright beams shining through the mirror, no flashing lights or anything. Just two dim red dots glowing steadily in the dark. It was so close I could almost read the license plate if my headlights hit it, but they didn't because they were off. No headlights, just the red taillights, glowing faintly through the night. The road narrowed even more as I climbed, and the trees grew thicker. The moon was low and hidden behind clouds, so the only light came from my car's headlights and those red dots behind me. My stomach tightened. Something about that car felt wrong. It was illegal to drive without headlights on a road like this, especially at night, and it was keeping pace behind me like it was following. I slowed down slightly to see if it would pass me. Usually, if someone is behind you for a while, they'll want to go faster or take the lead. But this car stayed right behind, matching my speed perfectly. Every time I accelerated around a corner or down a straight stretch, those taillights stayed steady behind me, like they were watching. I didn't dare look away for long. The highway curves were getting sharper now, and the trees were so close I could see branches scraping against the side of my car as I turned. The sound of the tires gripping the pavement filled the silence. I wanted to believe that the car behind was just another driver like me, maybe lost or tired, but my gut told me otherwise. I remember the stories people told about that stretch of road, drivers getting followed or worse, but I pushed those thoughts away. The rational part of me said maybe the driver behind me had a broken headlight, or maybe it was an emergency vehicle of some kind. But no sirens, no flashing lights, no other signs. I tried to stay calm. I kept my eyes forward, checking the mirrors often. The car stayed exactly the same distance behind me, close enough to see the glow of the red lights, but never passing, never leaving. It was like it was stuck on my tail. Then I came to a sharp left bend, the kind that cuts through a cliff edge with a steep drop on one side. My car's headlights caught the guardrail and the jagged rocks far below. I slowed even more, taking the turn carefully, hugging the inside lane. As I rounded the bend, the red lights behind me suddenly vanished. One moment they were there, just a little way back, and the next moment they were gone. No flash of passing, no quick disappearance. Just nothing. My heart jumped. I stopped the car at the edge of the turn and looked back over my shoulder and down the road. The headlights still cut bright slices through the dark in front, but behind me, only blackness. No other cars, no tail lights. I waited a minute. The row behind me was empty. I started to wonder if I had imagined it, but the feeling in my chest wouldn't let me. It had been too real. Then, as I sat there, I noticed something on the ground near the guardrail where I had stopped. There was a long, deep scrape in the asphalt, like a car had braked hard or slid on the road. The marks curved sharply, following the bend exactly where the car behind me must have been. I got out of my car and walked closer. The night air was cold and smelled like pine and wet earth. The scrape was fresh, the black tar torn up and rough. And next to the scrape, a faint patch of oil stained the pavement. It looked like something had been leaking. I crouched down to get a better look. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The scrape was too perfect, too deliberate. It looked like someone had lost control, Or maybe someone had purposely swerved to disappear around that bend. I thought about what might have happened to the driver behind me. Did they hit the guardrail? Did their car spin out? Or did they stop somewhere hidden, waiting to come back? I looked up and down the road. The trees were thick and the steep drop was on one side, meaning there was no shoulder or place to pull off easily. If a car had crashed there, I probably wouldn't see it right away, especially at night. I sat back in my car, my hands shaking a little. I wasn't sure what was more unsettling, that the car had followed me with no lights or that it had vanished without a trace. I thought about calling the police or reporting it, but cell service was spotty at best on this road. I was miles from the nearest town, and I wasn't even sure if I had the strength to keep driving. Still, I knew I had to get off that mountain road. I turned the key, started the engine, and began to drive again. This time, I kept my eyes glued to the road and the mirrors, watching for any sign of that car coming back. For the next 10 miles, nothing followed me. No red lights, no shadow behind me, just the steady hum of my tires and the wind through the trees. When I finally reached the highway that led to the town, my phone signal returned. I called the local sheriff's office and told them what I'd seen. They asked for details about the scrape and the oil and promised to check the area. The next day, I drove back with a friend who was more familiar with the area. We stopped at the bend. Sure enough, the scrape was still there, and the oil stain had darkened, fresh and unmistakable. They said cars had crashed there before, often because of the tight turn and narrow road. It was a spot where it was easy to lose control, especially at night. I learned later that the vehicle with no headlights probably had a mechanical failure, and maybe the driver was trying to keep up behind me, hoping for help. Or, well, maybe they lost control and crashed just out of sight. It was terrifying to think about being followed like that. But what scared me most was knowing how easy it was for something bad to happen on that road in the dark, and how close I'd been to a real accident without even realizing it. That night stayed with me, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of the raw, real danger that lurks on quiet mountain roads when the world is silent and you're alone.